My friend and I had this small, quiet spot we liked to camp at, a pond surrounded by thick pines and a wide clearing that felt completely cut off from the rest of the world. It sat right on the edge of a national forest in Northern California, hidden far enough that you couldn't stumble across it unless you already knew where to go. The trail that led there wasn't even an official one. It started off a dirt road barely wide enough for my truck, and then wound through a narrow path of brush and fallen trees before opening up near the water. We had been there many times over the years, always alone, never seeing footprints, tire marks, or old fire rings from anyone else. It was our secret place, quiet and untouched. That morning started off normal. The air was cold, the kind that stings your nose when you breathe in. The sun was still low behind the ridges, making the forest glow gold and pale blue at the same time. We had stopped at the same pull-off we always used, a small patch of gravel barely big enough for the truck. I remember how silent everything was. No wind, no birds. Just that kind of stillness you get deep in the woods before the day fully wakes up. I turned off the ignition, and as the engine ticked down, we both saw something moving up ahead in the dirt lot. It took a second for my eyes to make sense of it. Two big shapes, tan and low to the ground. At first, I thought it was just deer or maybe coyotes, but then I realized. Mountain lions. 2 of them, not 30 yards from the truck. It was surreal. I had only ever seen one from a distance before, and now there were 2 right there. My first thought was that they might notice us, but they were completely locked into each other, mating right in the middle of the road like we didn't exist. For a few seconds, I actually forgot how dangerous they were. It was wild and kind of mesmerizing to see. I could tell my friend was frozen too. We didn't move, just sat there in the cab with the windows rolled up, watching these 2 huge cats in the middle of this completely empty stretch of forest. Their muscles rippled every time they shifted. Even through the glass you could see how powerful they were. We stayed that way for maybe 5 minutes, just staring. At one point I thought about backing up and leaving because being that close to mountain lions isn't something anyone wants to risk, but we were both so fascinated that we couldn't look away. Eventually they finished and just stayed near each other, moving lazily through the brush by the side of the road. One of them stretched out on a patch of dirt, the other stood, tail twitching slowly. It felt like we were watching a scene from a wildlife documentary, except it was right in front of us. Then, out of nowhere, their behavior changed completely. Both of them went from calm to tense in an instant. Their ears shot up, bodies stiffened, and they turned toward the woods behind them. It wasn't subtle either. It was that full, locked-in alert stance animals get when something serious is nearby. I thought maybe they smelled us, but they didn't even look our way. They were focused on something deeper in the trees. I couldn't hear anything inside the truck, but their reaction made the hair on my neck stand up. One of them took a few steps backward, tail down now, and the other let out this low movement like it was ready to bolt. They stared for a few more seconds and then both turned and ran, fast, low to the ground, disappearing into the brush like they'd never been there at all. For a few seconds, everything was still again. Just the empty clearing, the quiet forest, the dirt road. I remember trying to see what had spooked them, my eyes flicking across the tree line. Then, just as I started to relax, something big crashed through the woods from the same direction the lions had been staring. 3 deer exploded out of the trees, sprinting full speed across the clearing. Their hooves tore up dirt and leaves as they bounded past, all heading downhill toward the open ground. Behind them came a bear. A massive one. Brown, wide-shouldered, the kind of animal that looks impossibly big up close. It was chasing them, crashing through the brush so hard I could feel the ground shake through the truck floor. It didn't even slow down when it broke into the open, just thundered after the deer like a freight train. The noise it made, the sound of branches breaking its heavy breaths, was terrifying even from inside the cab. I don't know how long it lasted. Maybe 10 seconds, maybe less. The deer sprinted into the trees on the other side of the clearing, and the bear followed, vanishing behind them like it had never existed. Then it was silent again, the kind of silence that feels wrong. We just sat there. My hands were tight on the steering wheel even though I wasn't driving. The forest looked calm again, but everything in me said it wasn't. The air felt heavy, still carrying the smell of dust and animal musk. Seeing the mountain lions react like that, then the deer, then that bear. It all hit at once that we were way out of our element. Out there in that patch of nowhere, we were just part of the food chain. We didn't say anything for a while. I remember my friend just shaking his head slowly, like he was trying to process what we'd seen. I could feel my heart beating hard in my chest, my skin buzzing from the adrenaline that hadn't gone away yet. Every small sound outside, a branch moving, a bird calling, made me flinch. After a few minutes, I turned the key and started the truck again. The sound of the engine felt too loud in that silence. I backed up slowly, glancing at the tree line every few seconds, half expecting the bear or one of the mountain lions to come back out. But nothing moved. The forest just stood there, quiet and thick and watching. We drove back down the road and didn't stop until we hit the main highway. It wasn't that we were scared of camping itself or even the animals, but that morning changed how I looked at that place. Before it had always felt like ours, some secret, untouched spot that belonged only to us. But after seeing that, I realized it didn't. That clearing, that pond, that whole patch of forest, it was wild in a way we had never really understood. We had been lucky every other time we went there. That morning just reminded us of it. We never went back after that. Not once. Every time I think about returning, I picture those two mountain lions freezing up, staring into the trees with that silent, tense fear. The kind of fear only wild animals understand. Whatever they sensed before running off, I know it was real, and I don't ever want to be close enough to find out what else was hiding out there that day. It was late in the season when my buddy and I decided to head out for a short camping trip in the Poudre Canyon, outside Fort Collins, Colorado. The nights were already getting cold, and most of the campgrounds had been closed for weeks. We weren't too worried about that. Between the two of us, we had years of experience camping all over Colorado and Utah. We'd slept in snow, in deserts, on cliffsides, and deep in forests. Finding our own spot had never been an issue. Still, something about this trip felt strange right from the start, and I remember that feeling staying with me the entire time we were out there. It wasn't fear, not yet. It was just a quiet discomfort that I couldn't explain. We drove down one of those narrow mountain roads, the kind where the edge of the gravel just drops into a steep ravine. The air was thin, sharp, and completely still. No wind, no sound. When we finally spotted a small clearing off the road, it looked like the perfect spot. There was a little flat area surrounded by pines and aspens, and it opened just enough to give us a view of the dark canyon below. It was secluded, maybe too secluded. I remember stepping out of the truck and just standing there looking around, feeling like we were intruding on something we shouldn't be part of. The place had this heavy silence that didn't feel natural. We unpacked anyway, brushed it off, and started setting up camp. The sun was still up but already low, and the temperature was dropping fast. As we gathered firewood, I noticed a shape under one of the trees, wrapped up in a dirty old blanket. It looked out of place, like it didn't belong there. I walked closer, thinking it might be trash. But when I lifted the corner of the blanket, I saw bones. It was the skeleton of some animal, maybe a dog or a coyote. The skull was small and thin, and it was wrapped carefully, not just tossed aside. Someone had taken the time to fold the blanket around it like a burial. The smell was faint, dry, and old. It wasn't fresh, but it was unsettling. We figured it was just someone's pet, maybe buried by a hiker or camper, and somehow it had been dug up. Still, it changed the whole atmosphere of the place. That weird feeling from before got heavier. I couldn't shake it. After setting up camp, we decided to hike a bit before it got too dark. The forest was dense and the hills were steep, covered in fallen branches and dead pine needles that made every step slide a little. The higher we climbed, the more the trees seemed to close in, and the less sound there was. Even our footsteps sounded muffled. About a half-mile up, we came across something else strange, an old tent. It wasn't on the ground. It had been pulled up and tangled into a tree like someone had wrapped it there intentionally. The fabric was faded and stiff, and the zippers were rusted. I remember my stomach tightening because for a second I was sure there would be a body inside. But when we cut it loose and looked inside, it was just a bunch of notebooks and an old sleeping bag. The notebooks were swollen from moisture and covered in dirt. I flipped one open, but the writing was mostly smeared, just dark lines and water stains. None of it made sense. The sleeping bag was moldy and torn, as if it had been there for years. It was eerie how deliberately placed everything seemed, like it had meaning to whoever left it. We started heading back down, following the side of the hill. It was steep and we had to grab onto branches and roots to keep from sliding. That's when we smelled it, the thick, heavy stench of decay. It was the kind of smell you recognize instantly even if you've never been around it much. It wasn't far away either. We slowed down, trying to see where it was coming from, and then I spotted it. There, wedged into a crook of a tree maybe 20 feet below us, was a small towel wrapped tightly around something. The towel was dirty, stained dark in some spots, and it had clearly been placed there on purpose. It wasn't at the base of the tree. It was tucked in at about chest height, secured between two branches. Whoever put it there had to have climbed up this steep hillside just to leave it in that exact spot. It didn't make any sense. The smell was strong enough that we didn't need to get closer to know what it was. Something dead was inside. We just stood there for a minute, looking at it, both of us feeling the same unease. It wasn't like finding a dead animal on the ground. It was like discovering something ritualistic, something that was done for a reason we weren't supposed to understand. We left it alone and kept hiking down until we reached camp again. The light was fading fast, the sun dipping behind the ridge. We started a small fire and poured some bourbon, trying to shake off the feeling that had been growing all day. The smell seemed to linger in my head even though we were far from that spot. The forest was completely silent again, not even the sound of insects. I remember sitting there, watching the fire, feeling like there was something just beyond the edge of the light. Something watching from the dark trees. Every time the wind rustled the branches, I'd flinch a little. I told myself it was just the eerie vibe from everything we'd found. The bones, the old tent, the smell. But the unease didn't fade. After a few drinks, we decided to go back up and look at the towel again. It wasn't about curiosity anymore, it was about needing to know. Not knowing what was in it felt worse than seeing it. So we grabbed a flashlight and a long stick and started hiking back up the slope. The ground was loose and rocky and the climb was tough, but the spot wasn't far. It was colder now and the air felt heavier. When we finally reached the tree, the smell was still there but fresher than before, sharper. The towel was just as we'd left it, damp from the evening air. I used the stick to lift one corner and that's when I saw feathers. Not fur feathers. The towel fell open a little and there it was. A freshly dead owl. The body was intact but stiff, its eyes still glossy and half open. It hadn't been dead long. The towel was clean on the inside, as if someone had taken care to wrap it properly. It was impossible to guess why anyone would do something like that. The hill was steep, far from any road, and the owl had been placed deliberately, not dropped or left behind. It looked like someone had carried it there for a reason that made sense only to them. We didn't say a word. We just stood there for a moment, the flashlight shaking slightly in my hand, the beam catching the white of the feathers and the dark stain spreading beneath. Then we turned around and climbed down, fast, slipping and sliding through the loose dirt and branches. When we got back to the fire, we sat in silence, finishing the bourbon without looking at each other. The forest stayed silent all night. I don't think either of us slept more than a few minutes. Every sound seemed like it came from just outside the firelight. The smell of the dead owl seemed to hang on my clothes, even though I'd never touched it. When the first light hit the canyon, we didn't waste time. We packed everything in a rush, doused the fire, and got out of there. The road back felt longer than when we came in, and I didn't look back once. I don't know what that place was or why someone had gone through the trouble of placing dead animals in those strange ways, but I know we weren't supposed to find them. Even now, thinking back on it, I can still feel the same cold weight in my chest that I felt standing on that hill, staring at that towel. It wasn't supernatural. It wasn't a ghost or a curse. It was something worse. It was human. Someone had done that, and that's what makes it hard to forget. I was traveling alone around the Olympic Peninsula in Washington, taking my time through the park, stopping wherever I felt like it. It was early fall, that strange time when the trees start to turn, but the air still holds on to a bit of summer warmth. I had been driving for hours through stretches of forest and fog, pulling off here and there just to see what I could find. When I got near Kino, I saw a small road branching off the main one, narrow and almost overgrown, and I decided to follow it. It wound through dense trees for a long while before finally dead-ending near the edge of the Kino River. It was quiet there, completely still, the kind of quiet where you can hear every tiny sound your shoes make on the gravel. The view was beautiful. The river was low and clear, cutting through the valley like a strip of glass. On the other side stood thick pines and moss-covered logs, the forest looking endless. There was an old wooden footbridge that stretched across the river, but it was warped and gray with age. Some of the boards were missing, and the ropes that held it up looked weathered and loose. It looked like something that had been left behind decades ago, and the thought of walking across it didn't even cross my mind. One wrong step, and it would have fallen apart under my weight. It was off-season, so there were no tourists, no cars, not even the sound of another engine in the distance. It was just me. The air was strangely hot for that time of year, heavier than it should have been, like the forest was holding its breath. I hadn't planned to swim that day, but standing there sweating and sticky from the drive, all I could think about was that cold water. The river looked shallow enough near the edge, and there was a wide patch of gravel and rock where I could get in easily. I backed my car up to the very edge of the road so that it was already facing the way I'd leave. I always do that when I'm alone, it's habit. I grabbed my towel, tossed my keys into my shoes, and started making my way down to the water. There wasn't any kind of path, just thick brush and blackberry vines. The kind that grab at your legs and tear at your clothes if you move too fast. The slope was steep and uneven, and I had to grab roots and small trees to keep from sliding. The air down near the water was cooler, and the sound of the current got louder until it was all I could hear. When I finally reached the edge, I took off my clothes and folded them near my shoes on a flat rock. I didn't bring a swimsuit, so I went in with just my bra and underwear. The water was freezing, but after a few seconds it felt amazing, sharp and clean. The bottom was rocky and uneven, but the water was clear enough that I could see my toes. For a while I just floated there, letting the current move me a little, listening to the forest creak and hum around me. Then that feeling hit me, the one that comes out of nowhere. The one where your body knows something's wrong before your mind does. It was like the air changed. Every sound from the forest stopped at once, and the back of my neck prickled. I looked around, scanning the other side of the river, the trees, the slope above me, but nothing moved. Still, that feeling didn't go away. It was like someone was watching me, close enough to see me, but quiet enough that I couldn't see them. I told myself it was nothing, maybe a deer, maybe just the wind. But the longer I stayed in the water, the stronger that feeling got. After a few minutes, I decided to get out. I turned toward my clothes and started climbing up the rocks, dripping and shivering. When I stood and turned back toward the river, that's when I saw him. He was standing across the river just on the opposite bank, a few feet higher up than me. At first, my brain didn't even register what I was looking at. He was tall, broad, with long, dirty hair tangled with twigs and leaves. He wore what looked like a poncho or cloak made out of animal pelts. His skin looked like it hadn't seen soap or water in years. I froze where I stood, still half-dressed and dripping, staring at him while my heart pounded so hard I could feel it in my throat. He didn't move. He just stared back at me, his face completely still. I couldn't tell how old he was, maybe 40, maybe 60. He looked wild, like he had been living out there for a long time. I didn't know what to do. My legs felt locked in place. I don't know how long we stood there like that. It could have been 10 seconds or a full minute. Then, without warning, he turned and started running toward the old bridge. Something inside me snapped then. I grabbed my car key from my shoe and tried to scoop up my clothes, but they were tangled in the blackberry vines. I didn't even try to untangle them. I dropped everything and started running. The vines ripped into my legs, my feet slipped on wet moss, and the brush tore at my skin, but I didn't stop. I didn't even look back. I just kept pushing through the thorns and branches, trying to reach the road before he got across that bridge. By the time I broke out of the brush, I could hear the creaking of the bridge behind me. I looked up and saw him halfway across, moving fast, his body swaying as the bridge groaned under his weight. I sprinted toward my car, barely able to breathe, bleeding and shaking. My hands were slick with sweat and blood when I yanked the door open and slammed it shut. Just as I locked the doors, he reached the car. The sound of his fists slamming onto the hood was deafening. He screamed. No words, just guttural, raw sounds that didn't even sound human. He slammed both hands on the hood again, his eyes wide and wild, then ran around to the side of the car and grabbed the handle. I hit the gas. The tires spun in the gravel before catching, and the car jerked forward hard. He chased after me, sprinting barefoot down the road, his arms swinging wildly. I looked in the mirror and saw him still running, faster than I thought anyone could run. I pushed the car harder, the engine whining, gravel spitting from the tires. He kept running until I hit the main road, and even then I saw him in the mirror for a few more seconds, shrinking behind me until he finally disappeared. I drove until I couldn't breathe anymore until I hit a main highway. I pulled over at a rest stop miles away, bleeding, covered in dirt and scratches still in my underwear. My hands shaking so badly I couldn't even put the car in park at first. I sat there for a long time trying to slow my breathing, staring out at the empty road. That night when I checked my legs, they were shredded from the blackberries. The cuts burned for days. I never went back for my clothes or anything I left there. I couldn't even bring myself to drive through that part of the park again. Even now, years later, I can still see his face. That blank expression when he first saw me, then the sudden wild energy when he started running. It wasn't random. He wasn't surprised to see me. He was waiting for something, and when he saw me, it was like something in him woke up. I've tried to forget it. Tried to tell myself it was just a moment of bad luck, but deep down I know it wasn't that simple. I've been back to the Olympic Peninsula since then, but never alone. I always bring someone now. Always keep the car close, always keep my keys in my hand. I used to love exploring the woods alone, but after that day I can't enjoy it anymore. The trees don't feel peaceful now, they feel like walls. That day changed how I see everything. I still think about how close it was. How if I had hesitated for even a few more seconds, he would have reached me before I got to the car. That thought keeps me awake sometimes. I know the forest holds all kinds of people. Campers, hunters, drifters. But whoever that man was, he wasn't just living out there. He was surviving out there, watching, waiting for something. I'll never understand what his plan was or what would have happened if I hadn't run. But I do know one thing. I was being hunted. And that knowledge has never left me. It was my first time ever camping, and I remember hating every second of it. I was in 7th grade, and the school had planned this big field trip to a campground that was about 5 hours away from home. Everyone else seemed excited about the idea of sleeping in cabins, roasting marshmallows, and telling stories by the fire. But all I could think about was how far away I was from my own bed and how badly I wanted to be home. The ride there was long and hot, and by the time we got to camp, I already felt sick from motion and nerves. The cabins looked old and smelled like wood, dirt, and mildew. The bunks were made of rough wooden frames with thin mattresses that barely counted as padding. I had been assigned to a top bunk, and when I laid down that first night, every creak of the wood made me think the whole thing was about to collapse. The air was stuffy inside and filled with the sound of kids whispering, laughing, or tossing around in their sleeping bags. I just lay there with my blanket pulled up to my chin, staring at the wooden ceiling, counting every breath and trying to fall asleep. But I couldn't sleep. The noises outside didn't help either. The forest around the cabin seemed alive. Every few minutes I'd hear a crunch of leaves or a rustle in the bushes. The wind made the trees sway and the branches scrape against the roof. And even though I knew we were surrounded by other cabins full of kids and teachers, I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that something was watching us. After what felt like hours of tossing and turning, I finally gave up trying to sleep. I was sweaty, uncomfortable, and restless. I quietly climbed down the ladder, trying not to wake anyone. The floorboards creaked under my feet as I slipped on my shoes and slowly pushed open the door. The air outside was cold enough to make me shiver. The sky was cloudy, with the moon barely glowing through the gray. The campfire from earlier was nothing but a faint orange glow of dying embers. The forest was still except for the occasional sound of a night insect or a distant hoot of an owl. The cabin sat in a loose row, and the faint outlines of trees behind them looked like a dark wall. I sat down on the wooden steps in front of my cabin, clutching a small book light in one hand and my paperback book in the other. I had been obsessed with Christopher Pike books at that age, and I carried one everywhere. I figured reading might calm me down. I clicked on the little light and started reading, the small circle of glow barely illuminating the page. The light made everything around me disappear into shadow, and that somehow made me feel both safe and uneasy at the same time. The silence of the night pressed around me, broken only by the quiet buzz of the light. After a while, my eyes started to sting from reading, and I realized how quiet everything was. Too quiet. I could hear my own heartbeat, and every now and then I found myself glancing up from the book, scanning the dark tree line. It wasn't like I heard something specific. It was just that strange, heavy feeling that someone or something was watching me. The kind of feeling that makes the hair on your arms stand up before your brain even knows why. I tried to shake it off, telling myself that there were probably raccoons or deer around. But every time I looked up, I couldn't stop scanning the shadows. My stomach felt tight, and my chest started to hurt from how hard I was breathing without realizing it. I told myself I was just scared for no reason, but that feeling wouldn't go away. Then, while turning a page, I shifted the book just a bit, and the light beam moved across the trees in front of me. For a second, the light caught something. Two small glowing points that reflected it back. They were low to the ground, but not too low. My mind didn't process it at first. I thought maybe it was a reflection from something shiny, maybe trash or metal. But then one of those glowing spots blinked. That's when it hit me. They were eyes. For a moment I froze. My entire body went still, like my brain didn't know what to do with that information. The light was still faintly catching those eyes, and as I focused, I realized they were higher up than I'd thought. Just a few feet off the ground, like something crouched and watching me. My hand started shaking, and I dropped the book. The light slipped off the page and rolled down one of the steps, landing on its side so it only lit up part of the ground in front of me. The light hit something else, a paw. It was massive, bigger than my hand, with thick fur and claws that dug slightly into the dirt. My breath caught in my throat. I followed the outline upward, my eyes adjusting just enough to make out the shape behind the light. It was a mountain lion. I had never seen one before in real life, but I knew instantly what it was. The way its shoulders were hunched, the way its body seemed coiled and tense like a spring ready to snap. I could see the faint twitch of its tail behind it, the way it shifted its weight slightly, studying me. It wasn't just passing through. It was watching me. My mind went completely blank except for two single thoughts. If I stayed there, someone would find a blood trail leading from the steps into the woods. And if I somehow lived through that, my dad would kill me for sneaking out of the cabin. My body didn't feel like mine anymore. I could barely breathe. Every tiny sound seemed like thunder in my ears. I didn't dare move, but I knew I had to get inside. The cabin door was just behind me. I could feel the rough wood against my back. I slowly slid one hand behind me, moving inch by inch, afraid to make any sudden movement. My fingers finally brushed against the cold metal of the door handle. My hands were shaking so hard that I couldn't get a good grip at first. The mountain lion hadn't moved yet, but its eyes were locked on me. I twisted the handle as slowly as I could, then pulled back. The door creaked, and in that instant I saw the lion's muscles shift, like it was getting ready to move. Panic took over. I threw myself backward through the door, hitting the floor with a dull thud. My foot kicked the door shut, and I twisted around and pushed it until it latched. I just lay there for a while, staring into the dark, my chest heaving. I could hear my own heartbeat pounding in my ears. My hands were shaking so bad I could barely breathe right. I stayed there on the floor for a long time, afraid to even move or look toward the window. Eventually, I climbed back into bed and pulled the blanket over my head, trying to convince myself it was fine, that it was over, but I didn't sleep at all. Every noise outside made me flinch, and I kept seeing those eyes in my head glowing in the dark. When the morning finally came, I felt like I'd been awake for years. One of the girls noticed my library book outside on the steps and asked how it got there. I just said maybe the wind blew it out. The teacher scolded me for leaving it behind and made me pick it up. I didn't say a word about what really happened. The thought of explaining it made me feel sick, like no one would believe me anyway. Years later, I still remember that night vividly. The air, the silence, the way those eyes stared back at me. I looked up mountain lions afterward, and it turns out they're usually silent hunters, often stalking before attacking. The thought that one might have been watching me that close, deciding whether or not to pounce, still makes my skin crawl. If I had moved a little faster, if I had dropped something louder, or if I had frozen for just a few seconds longer, I might not have made it inside in time. I don't think anyone would have even heard it happen. I was just a kid sitting outside with a book, and in one heartbeat, I had been a breath away from being prey. Even now, whenever I go camping or even just hear something move outside at night, I think about those eyes and that quiet, waiting shape in the dark. It taught me what real fear feels like, the kind that doesn't fade even after years. It happened a few years back, but I still remember every detail like it just happened yesterday. It was opening day of deer season, early November, and the air had that cold, damp feeling that seeps through every layer of clothing. My cousin owns a big chunk of land in western Wisconsin, mostly hills covered with oak and pine, with valleys full of tall grass and a few patches of swampy ground. It's a place we all grew up hunting. My dad, cousin, and their friends built a small shack there years ago. Just a single-room structure with a wood stove, a table, a few chairs, and a calendar pinned on the wall where we'd mark where each person was hunting for the day. It wasn't fancy, but it was tradition. Every year we came back, no matter how cold or how slow the season was. That morning, my dad and I were the first ones out. The plan was to head to a hilltop stand on the north side of the property. It was about a 20-minute ride from the shack on the ATV, uphill most of the way. We got there before sunrise, around 5:45 a.m., parked the ATV near a cluster of birch trees, and hiked up another few hundred yards to the stand. The woods were quiet, the air still. The only sound was our boots crunching through frost-hardened leaves and the distant sound of wind brushing against the trees. The sun hadn't yet come over the ridge, and the woods were painted in that faint gray light that makes everything look flat and still. We got settled in before first light, sitting there in silence. The stand overlooked a narrow valley, the kind of place deer like to move through in the morning. I scanned the tree line over and over, waiting for movement, waiting for that flick of an ear or that flash of white. But nothing came. The hours dragged on, and the cold started biting through my gloves. I remember blowing into my hands, rubbing them together, watching my breath drift away in the cold air. Around 9, my dad decided we'd go back for coffee and warm up before heading out again. It had been dead quiet. Not a single deer, not even a squirrel or bird. It felt strange, the kind of stillness that doesn't feel peaceful but uneasy, like everything out there was hiding. We packed up, checked our rifles, and started heading back down the hill. The slope was steep with loose leaves and patches of mud, so we had to move slow. We stopped a few times to listen for movement, just in case something had started walking nearby. Usually the forest has its sounds, branches creaking, small animals moving, maybe a crow in the distance, but that morning it was just empty. I could hear my dad's boots crunching a few steps ahead of me, steady and even. I followed his rhythm, stepping when he did, matching the sound so we wouldn't make too much noise. That's something he'd taught me years ago, and it usually worked well when walking together in the woods. We were about halfway down when I heard something else. At first I thought maybe it was just the echo of our steps bouncing off the trees, but the more I listened, the more wrong it felt. The sound was too close, too clear, and it matched my steps exactly. Every crunch, every pause. Whenever I stopped, it stopped. Whenever I moved, it started again, half a beat behind me. It wasn't my dad. He was in front of me, maybe 20 feet away. The sound came from behind, up the hill. I turned around and stared up through the trees. The hill behind us was covered in shadows because the sun still hadn't made it over the ridge. Everything was washed in that dull gray light again. I scanned the slope, the trees, the undergrowth. Nothing moved. It was completely still. I waited there for a while, listening hard, trying to hear the sound again. Nothing. I told myself it was probably just a deer circling behind us, or maybe my imagination from too many cups of coffee and not enough sleep. I started walking again, matching my dad's steps like before. But after only a few seconds, I heard it again. This time I didn't stop right away. I turned my head slowly while still walking. That's when I saw something move behind a tree about 30 yards uphill. It ducked fast like someone pulling their head back when they're caught watching. My first thought was that it was one of my cousin's friends. Maybe someone who hadn't checked the hunting schedule at the shack. But then I remembered we were the only ones there. My cousin wasn't supposed to show up until later that morning with his daughter. I kept staring at the tree. Then I saw a pale face peek out from behind it. It wasn't far, close enough that I could see the light hit its skin. It wasn't wearing orange, no hat, no coat that I could see, just a bare head. The face pale as the frost on the ground. It stayed there for a few seconds, then pulled back again. My stomach dropped, and every instinct I had screamed to get out of there. I wanted to believe it was just another hunter, but the more I stared, the more wrong it looked. I took a few slow steps backward, still facing the tree. The face came out again, this time holding still. It didn't look right. The proportions seemed off, and the neck too long, the shoulders uneven. The body that stepped out after that looked twisted, like its arms didn't hang right. It stood there, motionless, watching us. I could see patches of skin that looked raw or scarred, maybe from burns or disease. It didn't move closer, just stood there, half hidden behind the trunk. We turned and got to the ATV as fast as we could without running. The air felt heavier the closer we got to it. I kept glancing over my shoulder, expecting that thing to be following us, but it didn't move from where it was. When the engine roared to life, it was the first real sound in that forest all morning. As we started driving down, I looked back one more time. That's when I saw its shoulder move like it was stepping out further, the body jerking unnaturally as it shifted behind the trees. We didn't stop until we got back to the shack. The sun had finally broken over the hills by then, lighting up the valley in a way that almost made it feel normal again, but it didn't. The woods behind us felt wrong, like something in them had changed. We went straight to the truck and drove out. Nobody else was there yet. I didn't even take off my gear until we were halfway down the gravel road. I haven't been back since that day. My dad still hunts there like nothing ever happened. He even got a deer the next season, and he acts like it's just another hunting spot. But I can't shake that image. That pale, misshapen body half hidden behind the trees, moving like it was trying to mimic how a person stands, but didn't know how. I've thought about it so many times over the years, trying to explain it away. Maybe it was a person, someone who had no business being out there, maybe hurt or sick or lost. Or maybe it was someone who had been living out there alone for a long time, far from anyone else. Whatever it wasn't right. I can still picture how it moved, not fast, not slow, just off. Like its body didn't work the way it should. That image has stuck with me every time I walk into the woods now. The sound of footsteps behind me that don't belong. The stillness that feels too heavy, the sense that someone is there even when you can't see them. I try to tell myself it was just a person. That's what I keep saying whenever I think about it. Just a person. But in the back of my mind, I know something about it didn't fit, and that's what keeps me from ever going back. I was 8 or 9 the first time something truly awful burned itself into my memory. My mom used to take me to a big reservoir not far from a national park. She made baskets from reeds and vines and dried plants she collected. And sometimes she brought me along to help. She'd always make a little game out of it for me. Told me she'd give me a nickel for every piece of trash I picked up while she worked. I remember that day being warm, a little cloudy, with that smell of wet mud and water weeds that always hung around lakes in the summer. The kind of day that felt normal in every way. I had a small bag for trash and a wicker basket for the things we were keeping. Sticks, bark, dry cattail stalks, and whatever else she could use. I wandered a bit down the shore, not too far from her, just enough to feel like I was doing something important on my own. The waterline was low, and there were pale lines in the mud where it had receded. There were beer cans half buried in the dirt, bits of old fishing line and broken glass. I was focused on finding things that would get me a few more nickels. That's when I saw what I thought was a glove lying near a rock where the water met the mud. It was pale and swollen, and at first I thought it was rubber, like one of those dish gloves people use. It even had that off-white color to it, I remember thinking someone must have dropped it while cleaning their boat or something. I picked it up without really thinking. The moment my hand closed around it, something felt wrong. The weight was off. It wasn't floppy like fabric or rubber. It was heavier, denser, and the texture wasn't smooth. It was soft in a way that made my stomach turn immediately. The fingers bent wrong when I lifted it. I looked closer and realized what I was holding. It wasn't a glove. It was a human hand. The skin was pale, a grayish pink, bloated from being in the water. The nails were still there, but the fingertips were starting to peel. There was a ragged edge of flesh and bone about 4 inches up from the wrist where it had been severed. I remember freezing up completely. I tried to scream but couldn't at first. Then the sound came out of me, high-pitched and broken, and once I started I couldn't stop. I didn't even realize I was still gripping it until my mom came running, shouting my name, and had to physically pry my fingers open. I remember her face when she saw it, the way her expression changed in an instant, and how she threw the thing back into the mud like it was poison. We went to the nearest gas station, because this was before cell phones. She made the call from there, her voice trembling while I sat outside on the curb, shaking and staring at my hands. The police went out to the lake. Later I overheard people saying it had come from a boating accident. A group of teenagers drinking, one of them falling off a power boat and getting hit by the propeller. They told me later it was probably a bear paw trying to comfort me, but I knew better. I had seen the fingernails, the creases on the knuckles, the lines of a human hand. I stopped talking for nearly 2 months after that. Every time I tried, the image came back. The soft give of that hand, the color of it, the way it felt when I touched it. Even now, decades later, I still have a hard time looking at anything freshly dead. I can skin a fish, I can handle old bones. But if it's recent, I feel that same sick feeling rise up in my stomach like I'm 8 again, standing on that muddy shore. Years later, when I was in college, I decided to go camping alone after a stressful semester. I needed quiet and space, somewhere I didn't have to think about deadlines or people or noise. I went to southwestern Colorado, an area I'd visited before. It was remote enough that I could hike a few miles and not see anyone for days. I parked at a trailhead, packed light, and started walking early in the morning. The air was cool, the kind of crispness that smells of pine and dirt, and I remember feeling calm for the first time in a long while. The hike went well for most of the day. I'd planned to make it to a small clearing near a creek and camp there for a night or two before heading back. Around mid-afternoon, I heard voices up ahead, a group of hikers laughing, talking loudly, the sound carrying through the trees. I didn't want company, not even friendly strangers. I wanted silence, so I veered off the trail, planning to cut through the woods and loop back around behind them. It wasn't far, just a short detour or so I thought. The forest off-trail was dense, thicker than I expected. Fallen branches tangled with tall ferns, and the ground sloped unevenly, forcing me to move slower. After a while, I couldn't hear the hikers anymore. I figured I'd gone far enough and started trying to find my way back to the trail. That's when I came across it. At first, I thought it was just a pile of bones from some animal remains. But as I got closer, I realized it was something else. The bones were arranged, stacked, and laid out carefully, forming a sort of table shape. It wasn't random. It was deliberate. Long leg bones, probably deer or elk, formed the structure, and smaller bones were tied and strung together, hanging from nearby branches. There were bits of wire, some metal scraps, maybe old cans cut into shapes dangling alongside the bones like wind chimes. The whole area had this strange stillness to it, as if even the air was holding its breath. I walked around it slowly, not touching anything. The more I looked, the more it became clear this wasn't something made by accident. Some of the bones were old and weathered, but others looked newer, still yellowish with little bits of tissue stuck to them. I could see faint marks on some, like they'd been cut or scraped. I couldn't tell what all of them were from, but there were definitely animal skulls mixed in, and maybe not all of them were animal. I stood there trying to understand what I was looking at, and a deep unease crept through me. It felt wrong in a way that went beyond the surface, like I had stumbled into something I wasn't supposed to see. I didn't hear or see anyone around, but I couldn't shake the sense that someone had been there recently. There were faint footprints in the dirt, boot prints, not animal tracks, and an old fire pit nearby filled with blackened stones. I remember my heartbeat picking up. I didn't think, I just started backing away, keeping my eyes on the thing until it was out of sight. When I finally turned, I walked fast, almost running, until I found the trail again. I didn't stop moving until I reached my car. By the time I got back to the road, the sun was going down and my hands were trembling so hard I could barely unlock the door. I drove home that night without camping, without stopping anywhere. I never went back to that part of Colorado. That was the last time I ever camped alone, maybe the last time I camped at all. Sometimes I think about both those moments. The hand at the reservoir and the bone altar in the woods. They happened years apart, but they sit in the same corner of my mind. 2 times when I saw something that reminded me how close horror can be to ordinary life. No ghosts, no curses, no impossible explanations. Just death, decay, and the strange things people or nature leave behind when no one's supposed to see them. Both times I walked away, but something stayed with me. Something quiet and heavy that's never really gone. When I was a kid, around 10 years old, my parents decided to take us camping in Mark Twain National Forest. It was just the 4 of us, my mom, my older sister who was 12, my stepfather, and me. We weren't staying at a campground, which even back then felt strange. My stepdad said he wanted privacy, but really he didn't like paying for things he thought he could get for free. We drove deep into the forest, further than we should have, until the gravel road turned into a rutted dirt path lined with thick trees on both sides. By the time we stopped, the sun was already sliding behind the hills and the woods were turning dark, faster than any of us expected. The air was still warm, but shadows were stretching long across the ground. We scrambled to get the tent up before it was pitch black. I remember the smell of damp leaves and pine needles, the hum of mosquitoes, and my stepfather's sharp tone as he barked orders at my mom and sister. He'd been drinking the whole drive, a half-empty bottle of whiskey in the cup holder. His words got louder and meaner as the light faded, and my mom kept her head down, doing what she could to keep him from getting worse. The tent poles didn't fit right, and my sister was near tears trying to hold a corner down while he yelled at her. By the time the tent was standing, night had completely swallowed the woods. There wasn't a single light anywhere. No glow from a nearby campsite, no car headlights on the road. We realized we had forgotten a lantern and the flashlight batteries were dead. The darkness was so thick it felt like it pressed up against your skin. My mom suggested starting a campfire, but my stepfather didn't want to bother. He just cursed under his breath, stumbled toward the tent, and said he was going to sleep. We didn't argue. None of us ever did when he was like that. We crawled into our sleeping bags in silence. The tent smelled faintly of mildew, and the ground beneath it was uneven, small roots poking into my back. My sister was beside me, trembling slightly, and I could hear my mom's breathing on the other side of the tent. Uneven, nervous, waiting for him to fall asleep so she could relax. I stared up into the dark fabric above me, trying to make out shapes or light through the seams, but there was nothing. Just blackness. Time passed strangely. I could hear insects outside, a soft, constant buzz, the occasional crack of a twig far off. I told myself it was just animals, maybe a raccoon or deer, but then the sounds started to change. The rustling began in the distance, steady, slow, not random like an animal foraging. It sounded like someone walking. Each step made the dry leaves crunch in a pattern that felt deliberate. My first thought was that maybe it was another camper, but then I remembered there were no lights anywhere. No campfire glow, no flashlight beam cutting through the trees. Whoever or whatever it was, they were moving without light. The steps would stop every so often as if the person or thing was listening. Then they'd start again, getting a little closer each time. My body froze. I remember holding my breath without realizing it, my small hands clutching the edge of my sleeping bag. My mom's breathing changed too. She'd heard it. We all had. Even my stepfather went quiet, which somehow made it worse. I could feel the tension filling the tent like something alive. The footsteps grew louder, slow and uneven, like someone carefully picking their way through the underbrush. I could almost picture the scene outside. The tall trees standing still, the dry leaves shifting underfoot, the faint breeze carrying that musty forest smell. Every few seconds there'd be a pause and I'd strain my ears, trying to guess where it was coming from. It was close. Too close. At one point I thought I heard breathing. Not ours. Something faint but distinct from beyond the thin nylon wall. A human rhythm, slow and steady. My stomach twisted and my skin prickled all over. It was as if whoever was out there had stopped right next to our tent. The sound of the forest seemed to vanish, leaving just that quiet breathing and the thudding of my heart. Then came the sharp crack of a twig snapping. Loud, clear, right beside us. In that instant, everything happened at once. My stepfather made a sound I had never heard before. It wasn't yelling, it was raw, terrified. Something deep that broke the air apart. I heard my mother gasp, and the tent shook as she scrambled toward the flap. My sister moved first, grabbing my arm and pulling me. The ground outside felt cold under my bare feet as I stumbled out. My eyes still useless in the dark. I could hear branches snapping behind us as we ran. All of us pushing through the brush, tripping over roots, not daring to look back. The car wasn't far. Maybe 100 feet from the tent, but it felt like a mile. The darkness was so thick it swallowed everything beyond arm's reach. My chest burned, my legs ached, and every step felt like something might reach out from the trees and grab me. I could hear my mother's frantic footsteps ahead, the sound of metal as she fumbled for the car door, and then the slamming of doors one after another. The headlights never came on. We didn't even stop long enough to turn them on. The engine roared and gravel spat out behind the tires as we sped away. I turned in my seat once, trying to look back through the rear window, but there was nothing but blackness. No lights, no movement, no sign of who or what had been there. We didn't speak a word the entire ride home. The only sound was the hum of the tires and my stepfather's shaky breathing. When we finally pulled into our driveway hours later, the sky was already pale with dawn. We went straight inside and didn't unpack, didn't talk about it, didn't even look at each other. We never went back for our things. The tent, the sleeping bags, everything we'd brought with us, we just left it there. My mom refused to bring it up again, and my stepfather pretended like it had never happened. My sister and I tried to forget, but we couldn't. For weeks afterward, I would wake up at night thinking I heard footsteps outside my window. That same slow, deliberate sound on dry leaves. Now I'm 43. And I still think about that night more often than I'd like to admit. Sometimes it comes back in dreams. I'm lying in that tent again, surrounded by darkness so thick I can feel it, and I hear those same footsteps approaching through the leaves. Every time I try to move, but I can't. The sound gets closer, one step at a time, until it stops right beside me. I never see who it is. I never will. But even after all these years, I still remember that feeling. The helpless silence, the thick air, and the certainty that someone was out there, watching us, waiting for something. And when I wake up, I lie there for a long time, listening to the quiet, reminding myself I'm safe, that it's over. But deep down, I still don't believe it ever really was. I'm a wetland biologist working out in Pennsylvania. And that day had started just like any other field day. It was early spring, the kind of morning where the fog hangs heavy over the lowlands, clinging to your boots and pant legs as you move through tall grass. I was in an area that had been cleared for some restoration work, mapping and flagging wetland boundaries for a project that had been dragging on for weeks. The air was cool and smelled of wet soil and leaf rot, that earthy scent that sticks to your clothes long after you've left the woods. I had parked my truck about a mile off an old access road near I-81S and hiked in with my pack, GPS, field notebook, and a shovel I used mostly to dig small test pits and check hydrology. The spot was a mix of old farmland and second-growth forest, with scattered piles of rusted metal and broken glass buried beneath the ferns. As I moved along a faint deer trail, I came across what used to be a farm reservoir, a shallow, moss-covered basin filled with stagnant water and cattails. It was being fed by a few small seeps and springs coming out of the hillside. My task for the day was to trace those water sources back up the slope, flagging the wetland boundary and noting where the hydrology changed. I worked my way up through the underbrush, stepping over fallen logs slick with moss, pushing through mountain laurel and thorny blackberry vines. The ground was soft and every step squelched. Occasionally I'd hear the rush of water under the leaf litter, tiny trickles joining together to form the small channels that eventually fed the reservoir. It was quiet, except for the hum of insects and the distant sound of a woodpecker tapping somewhere deep in the trees. The further I went up the hill, the less sign there was of anyone having been there for a long time. Until suddenly, there was. I crested a low rise and stepped into a small clearing that looked completely out of place. There was an old rusted-out refrigerator tipped on its side, half sunk into the mud. A few lawn chairs sat around what had once been a fire pit, their aluminum frames bent and flaking with rust. Scattered on the ground were beer cans, mostly Natural Light, and old tuna cans with the labels faded and peeling off. There were chewing tobacco tins, a busted cooler, and a pile of plastic bags torn apart by animals. It looked like an old hunting camp that someone had abandoned years ago, or maybe a homeless hideout. Stuff like that isn't rare on public land. When old private properties are sold off, people leave all kinds of junk behind. Still, something about that clearing felt wrong. Everything was arranged too neatly, too intentionally, like someone had tried to make it look abandoned. I stood there for a while, scanning the area, trying to decide if it was worth taking a waypoint or just moving on. That's when I noticed movement behind me. When I turned, there was a large German shepherd standing just a few yards away. It was well-groomed, clean, not the kind of dog that lives rough in the woods. Its coat was shiny and it looked strong, alert. My first thought was, great, now I'm screwed. I had no idea where it came from or if it was going to attack. I tightened my grip on my shovel handle and braced myself. But the dog didn't growl or charge. It just stood there watching me. Then it turned around, walked a few steps up the hill, and looked back at me like it wanted me to follow. I hesitated, but it didn't seem aggressive, and it was obvious the dog belonged to someone. Maybe its owner was camping somewhere up the ridge or got hurt. The dog took a few more steps and looked back again, waiting. Against better judgment, I followed. I figured if someone was out there and needed help, I'd feel like an idiot for ignoring it. The slope got steeper as I went. The ground littered with damp leaves and branches. The air grew colder the higher I climbed, the sunlight thinning out under the dense canopy. After about 5 minutes of following, the smell hit me. Sharp, rotting, unmistakably animal. It got stronger as I climbed. The dog stopped near another small clearing, this one choked with ferns and small saplings. When I stepped into it, I froze. Scattered in the dirt were dozens of old dolls, maybe 20 or 30 of them, half buried up to their necks in a rough circle. Their faces were cracked, faded, some missing eyes or hair, and all of their arms were pointed upward toward the center of the clearing. And in that center, hanging from a tree limb about 10 feet off the ground, was a large deer carcass. It wasn't fresh. The fur was patchy and darkened with rot, the legs dangling stiff. A length of rope looped around its hind legs and up over the branch. Below it, the ground was disturbed, scuffed footprints, drag marks, a few tools that looked like they'd been used to cut it open. The smell was thick and I could hear flies buzzing. The dolls, though, were what really got me. Someone had gone through a lot of trouble to bury them that way, like a ritual or warning. The soil around them was freshly disturbed compared to the rest of the clearing. Dark and damp like someone had been there recently. The dog stood a few feet ahead of me, silent now, just staring at the hanging deer. I felt the hair on my arms rise. It didn't make sense. This wasn't a hunter's kill. No one would leave a deer like that to rot, especially not suspended in a tree. It looked deliberate, maybe meant to send a message. My chest tightened as I scanned the area, half expecting to see someone watching from the trees. The woods were dead quiet. No birds, no insects, nothing. That was the moment I decided I was done. Whatever was going on there, it wasn't my business. I turned around slowly, careful not to make noise, and started back down the hill. The dog didn't follow this time. I didn't look back to see what it was doing. My only goal was to get back to the reservoir and then to my truck. The hike back felt longer than before, every crack of a branch behind me making my pulse spike. I kept my eyes on the ground, my shovel in a tight grip, and my ears tuned to every sound. By the time I reached the edge of the reservoir, the light had started to fade. The fog had crept back in, thicker now, and the woods seemed to close in around me. My legs were shaking by the time I saw the glint of my truck through the trees. I didn't stop to take another note, didn't mark another waypoint. I threw my gear in the back, climbed in, and just sat there for a moment, catching my breath. My hands were still trembling. I didn't report what I saw. I didn't call anyone or take a picture. Maybe I should have, but I didn't want to explain why I was there or risk someone thinking I was involved. I was getting married in a month, and I had no intention of getting caught up in whatever that was. Whether it was some deranged hunter, a backwoods cult, or just a twisted prank, it wasn't worth finding out. I drove straight back to the highway and didn't stop until I was miles away. That job was finished soon after, and I told the team I wouldn't be heading back to that site for any follow-up surveys. They didn't ask why, and I didn't offer a reason. Even now, years later, I still think about that clearing sometimes. The dolls, the smell, the way the dog seemed to lead me there on purpose. I'll never know what that place really was or what was meant to happen there, but I know this. Whatever it was, I got out before I became part of it, and I'll never set foot anywhere near that hill again. I still remember the smell that week more than anything else. The air had this thick, burnt taste that clung to everything. It didn't matter if you were inside or outside. Smoke found its way into every crack, every breath. The hills that usually looked so green and calm behind our house turned into something else. The fire started far away. Or at least that's what everyone said on the news at first. But fire doesn't stay far away for long when the wind starts pushing it downhill. By the end of June, the smoke was already hanging over both national forests behind us like a dirty fog. When I got off work that day, my clothes already smelled faintly of smoke even though I worked miles from the line. My dad had just come home too, his face tired and gray from the long hours and stress. I told them we should start getting ready to evacuate, that it was getting too close, but at first they brushed it off. We had seen fire before, small ones that died out after a few days. But this time, when I stepped out onto the porch, I saw the whole ridge glowing. The top of the mountain was alive with orange light. It wasn't just a fire anymore, it was the mountain burning. The first thing I did was go for the legal documents. Birth certificates, medical files, passports, insurance papers, all the boring but important things that end up meaning everything when you lose a home. They were scattered in different drawers and boxes, so it took me longer than I thought. About half an hour went by before I finally had them all packed into a folder and sealed in a bag. I remember my hands shaking while I did it. Not from fear exactly, but from the thought that this could be the last time I'd ever stand in that house. Then I went to help my youngest sister. She was only 8 and already having panic attacks. Her face was red and wet with tears, and she kept clutching her stuffed animals like they were the only things keeping her safe. It broke me to see her like that. I had to tell her she couldn't bring them all, that she could only take a few. She looked at me like I was taking her whole world away. In the end, she picked a few of her favorites and the little elephant she got from the ambulance when she was 4. I tried to help her pack clothes and small things, but she couldn't focus. She was too busy crying quietly, her small hands shaking as she tried to zip her backpack. I packed most of it for her because she just couldn't. My other sister was different. She was calm in a way that made me nervous. She had everything she wanted packed into one small bag, and she just sat there waiting. It was strange how 2 people could react so differently to the same situation. I didn't know what to say to her, so I just moved on. My parents told me to go pack my own things next. I went upstairs to my room, and the heat hit me like a wall. It was summer, and being on the top floor made it worse. The air conditioner couldn't keep up with the weather or the smoke. I started gathering what I could, some of my artwork, a few personal items, and my purse collection, which I had saved up for years. Then, while trying to decide what to leave behind, I broke down. The idea that the walls around me could soon be ashes made my stomach twist. I sat on the floor, sweating and shaking, trying to breathe, but the air felt like it was getting heavier by the minute. My chest started tightening, the warning sign of my asthma acting up. I forced myself to slow down, drink some water, and push through it. After that came the animals. We had 12 hens, 2 guinea pigs, and 2 dogs. I knew we couldn't leave them. We started gathering food and supplies. Bags of chicken feed, the guinea pigs' bedding, dog food, water, hay, leashes, harnesses, bowls. The list never seemed to end. Every time we thought we were done, we'd remember something else. My dad had gone to get a trailer from his boss, and by the time he came back, the fire was already halfway down the mountain. You could see it clearly through the trees, moving fast, eating up everything in its path. I put the guinea pigs in their transport cage and set them by the door. The dogs were restless, pacing back and forth because they could smell the smoke. I wasn't allowed to help carry things outside since my asthma could have gotten worse in the heavy smoke. So I stayed inside, making sure everything was ready to go. The sound of things being loaded, the scrape of boxes, the metallic clink of tools, the slam of the trailer door, echoed through the house like a countdown. When night finally came, the mountain looked like it was made of fire. The flames moved in slow waves down the slope, glowing orange and red against the black sky. My parents said we would stay one more night and wait for updates before leaving. I was exhausted, too tired to argue, so my sisters and I laid down near the front door with our bags close by. The fire made the whole sky glow. Even at midnight, the yard was lit up in this strange orange light that turned everything into long, flickering shadows. It was terrifying, but also mesmerizing. I don't know why, but I couldn't stop watching it. The fire moved like something alive, and the way the smoke mixed with the moonlight gave it an almost unreal look. The sky had streaks of purple and red, and the air shimmered with heat. It was like looking at a painting you didn't want to exist. My eyes burned, but I kept staring. The sound of the fire was faint but constant, a low rumble that never stopped. I read a book to calm myself and eventually drifted off, the smell of smoke still strong in my nose. I woke up several times during the night, and every time the fire seemed a little different. The first time I woke, the flames were closer. The second time, they looked weaker. By the third time, I thought maybe I was dreaming because they seemed to be fading. When I finally opened my eyes for good, the sun wasn't even up yet. It was around 6 in the morning. The mountain was still smoking, but the flames were small now. Patches here and there, not the huge wall that had been crawling toward us hours before. I woke everyone up, and when we stepped outside, the air felt different. It was still smoky, still hot, but the sound was gone. No more crackling or rumbling, just the soft hiss of dying embers. That morning, we found out that several local fire departments had worked through the night. They had cut a fire line just in time, stopping the flames a few hundred yards from our property. That line saved the town. If they hadn't done it, we would have lost everything. One firefighter had been badly burned, but he survived and was recovering. A helicopter fighting the fire had crashed the night before, but somehow everyone inside survived too. By the time the sun came up, the sky was filled with a dull gray haze. The mountain was black and scarred. The smell of ash and wet dirt hung in the air after they dropped water on the hot spots. It was over, but it didn't feel like it. The silence afterward was almost worse than the noise during the fire. They said around 35,000 acres had burned. One house and a few government buildings were gone. No one died, but the damage was everywhere. We were lucky, but it didn't feel like winning. The fire had taken things that couldn't be replaced. Our old dog, Lady, had died years earlier in a house fire, and I couldn't stop thinking about her that night, wondering what she would have done if she'd been there. Our bird, Thunder, had passed away from an accident before all this, and Rex, the fox I cared for at the animal sanctuary, died from heat stroke and a heart attack during the fire. It felt like every memory of loss was pulled to the surface again. When the last smoke faded and the mountain turned gray instead of red, I stood in the yard and stared at it for a long time. It looked smaller now, like the fire had stripped away its strength. The air was heavy with the smell of what was gone. We hadn't lost our home, but we lost something else that night, the sense that home was unshakable. Fire showed us how fragile everything really was. Even now, when I see the mountain at sunset and the sky turns orange, part of me freezes. It's beautiful in the same way it was terrifying. I don't think that feeling will ever fully go away. I camped in Sequoia National Park last summer, spending a few days alone trying to get away from everything. I had been driving for hours through the park roads before I finally found a quiet pull-off spot, far enough from any of the main campsites. It was a clearing surrounded by tall trees, the kind that seemed to reach forever into the dark sky. I set up in the bed of my truck, laid out my sleeping bag, and just let the quiet of the forest sink in. There's something heavy about the stillness out there at night. No distant traffic, no hum of power lines. Just wind moving through the branches and the occasional creak of the woods settling. Before sleeping, I decided to climb up on a nearby boulder to look at the stars. The air was cool, dry, and smelled faintly like pine sap and dust. The rock was smooth from years of rain and wind. When I reached the top, I found these shallow bowls carved into the stone, perfectly rounded depressions that looked deliberate. Beside them were long grooves, almost like someone had sharpened blades there centuries ago. I knew Native American tribes had lived throughout this area long before the park existed, and I figured those carvings were the remains of their tools or food preparation spots. It felt strange to touch something that old, like pressing your hand against time itself. I sat there for a while, staring up at the sky full of stars. The Milky Way looked thick, like a river of smoke stretching above the trees. It made me feel small, and for a while everything was quiet and calm. When I finally climbed down and settled in my truck bed, I remember how easy it was to fall asleep. The temperature dropped, the crickets got louder, and the trees moved in slow rhythm with the wind. I don't know how long I slept before it happened, but I remember it so clearly that it still makes my skin crawl thinking about it. It felt like I woke up suddenly. My eyes opened and everything was wrong. I wasn't in the bed of my truck anymore. I was lying flat on the ground in my sleeping bag, surrounded by trees. The sky was darker than it had been earlier, no stars visible through the thick canopy. The air felt heavier, almost wet, like it does before a storm. My first thought was that maybe I had rolled out or sleepwalked somehow, but as I looked around, I didn't recognize where I was. The shapes of the trees were unfamiliar, and the forest floor was covered with dead leaves and black soil that seemed to sink slightly under my body weight. Then I noticed movement. It started as a faint rustling sound, like dry grass shifting in the wind, but it grew louder and closer. When I turned my head to the left, I saw them. Hundreds of small black shapes writhing and sliding over each other. At first I thought it was shadows moving, but as my eyes adjusted, I saw they were snakes. Thin, slick, eel-like snakes slithering past me in a continuous wave, all moving in the same direction. Their bodies glistened faintly in the dim light, and I could see the quick flicker of tongues tasting the air. I froze, hardly breathing, watching as they passed within inches of my sleeping bag. The sound was wet and constant, like rain hitting mud. The mass of snakes twisted and rolled together, creating an almost fluid movement. My stomach tightened as I realized just how many there were. It looked endless, like they were pouring out from somewhere deeper in the forest. Then, out of that black, writhing column, a larger shape lifted its head. A rattlesnake, thick and pale with dark bands, pushed its way free from the swarm. It moved differently than the others, slow, deliberate, almost aware. It slid closer to my side, and I could hear the dry rattle of its tail. It lifted its head above the edge of my sleeping bag and struck, hitting the fabric just above my leg. I felt the thud, but not the bite, the material just barely protecting me. I kicked out instinctively, trying to move away, my feet tangling in the bag. The snake retracted, coiling for a moment before sliding back into the mass. The others kept moving, crawling over each other, undisturbed, as if they didn't even notice me. I followed the direction they were heading, trying to understand what was happening. That's when I saw it, the body of a horse lying on its side a few feet away. It was large, black, and unmoving. The air around it smelled sharp, metallic, mixed with something rotten. The stomach was sliced open cleanly, like it had been cut with a knife, not torn by animals. The snakes were crawling into the open cavity, disappearing inside one by one. The sight made me sick. The whole ground seemed to pulse with movement as they filled the hollow space within the dead horse. I could see the twitching under its skin as the last of them disappeared. My chest tightened and a wave of panic hit me. The forest suddenly felt alive in a way that didn't make sense. I could hear something like a faint hum. Not from the snakes, but from the trees themselves, like the entire place was vibrating. The smell grew stronger, overwhelming. My head spun, and I felt this deep dread sitting in my gut, heavy and cold. I remember trying to move, but my body felt numb. I couldn't tell if I was awake or still dreaming, but the fear was real enough to make my hands shake. The last thing I remember was forcing myself to look away, closing my eyes as tightly as I could. Then everything went black. When I opened them again, I was back in my truck. It was still night, but the air was different, colder, sharper. I was drenched in sweat, breathing hard, heart pounding. My sleeping bag was exactly where I had left it. Nothing around me was disturbed. The forest was still just the faint rustle of leaves. It was so real that I jumped out of the truck to check the ground to see if maybe I had actually moved or if something was there. The dirt was untouched. No sign of anything. I stayed awake until the sun came up, sitting on the tailgate, watching the forest slowly turn gold in the morning light. I tried to tell myself it was just a dream, that my brain had twisted the shapes and sounds of the forest into something nightmarish. But the image of those snakes and that horse wouldn't leave my head. It didn't feel like a regular dream. It felt like something my mind wasn't supposed to see. When I packed up that morning, I walked back to the boulder where I had been the night before. The mortar bowls and sharpening grooves were still there, just as I'd found them. I stood there for a while, staring at them, thinking about how long they'd been there and what kind of lives the people who made them had lived. It was strange to think about how much blood and history the ground could hold. I left that day feeling different, not scared exactly, but aware, like I had touched something old that wasn't meant to be disturbed. I've camped plenty of times since then, but I've never gone back to that part of Sequoia. Every now and then I still dream about the sound of something sliding through the dirt, that soft, wet movement, and it wakes me up before I can see anything else. I tell myself it was just my mind playing tricks, but deep down I think it was the place itself reminding me that not everything buried stays silent. I woke up to the sound of water moving strangely close. The dull rhythm of waves lapping against the gravel shore had a different tone that morning. Heavier, louder, too deliberate to be wind or current. It was early, gray light still hanging low through the fog. I could tell from the chill inside the tent that the sun hadn't touched the lake yet. The air had that kind of wet bite that gets into your bones, the kind that makes your breath visible even if you're still half asleep. I stayed still for a second, my sleeping bag pulled up tight, listening. There it was again, the sound of something swimming. Not small splashes, not ducks or fish, but slow, strong pushes through the water, each one spaced just enough apart to tell me it was big. I knew that sound. Anyone who spent enough time out here learns it. A bear swimming. And it was coming closer. I didn't move. My camp was set right near the tree line on a narrow stretch of gravel, the kind of place bears crossed all the time, moving between the salmon streams. The smell of last night's fire and the lingering scent of cooked oatmeal probably clung to everything. I regretted leaving the pot outside. I could hear the bear reach the shallows now, water breaking off its body as it moved toward land. A few more steps and I heard the faint thud of paws on wet gravel. My whole tent felt like it was breathing with the sound of it. I just lay there counting every heartbeat, thinking how thin nylon felt when there was 1,000 pounds of muscle walking a few yards away. It sniffed once hard, the sound cutting through the early stillness, and then after what felt like forever it moved off toward the trees. I waited another 5 minutes before unzipping the tent and looking out. There were wet paw prints along the edge of camp, deep and wide, leading away into the fog. That wasn't the first close moment I'd had out there. A few weeks later, I was hiking a survey line near one of the upper valleys where the willows grew thick. The air was warm and heavy, full of mosquitoes, and I'd been pushing through brush for hours, flagging boundaries and marking points. The ground was soft and uneven, water seeping under the moss with every step. I could smell the faint rot of the tundra mixed with crushed berries. Then I felt that sudden shift in silence that happens right before you realize you're not alone. The birds had gone quiet. I stopped walking, trying to listen over the sound of my own breathing. There was a faint exhale behind me, almost too soft to catch, but real enough to turn my stomach to ice. I turned slowly, my boot sinking in the mud. 15 meters back through the brush stood a sow and her cub. Both still, both watching me. The mother's nose was up, her breath showing in short bursts, her fur damp from the brush she'd pushed through following my scent. The cub shifted behind her legs. I'd seen plenty of bears before, but being that close without warning does something different to you. You can feel how fragile you are in that instant. The sow didn't move for several long seconds, just sniffed again, and I could tell she was deciding what I was. My flagging tape fluttered in the breeze, and I realized how stupidly bright it looked against all that green. I stood frozen, barely breathing. Eventually she turned, nudging the cub, and they disappeared back into the willows, quiet as ghosts. I waited until I couldn't hear them anymore before my legs started to work again. Another time I had to camp near a lake that had been recently visited by a wounded boar. There was a half-eaten moose carcass nearby, and when I'd passed it earlier in the day by boat, the smell was thick and sour, full of flies. I had no choice but to camp there. It was the only dry ground before the next stretch of marsh. That night I heard the grunt first, deep and wet like an animal breathing through pain. I knew it was the boar before I even unzipped the tent. When I did, the moonlight caught its shape, a dark, heavy form pacing near the trees. I grabbed my flare gun and yelled, waving it in the air until it turned and ran off into the brush. For a while the only sound was the crackle of the fire, and my own pulse hammering in my ears. Then 10 minutes later I heard it again, closer this time. I fired another flare, the red light washing over its scarred face before it turned again. But it kept coming back, over and over. It would disappear into the dark, then circle back, huffing, pacing, testing me. It went on like that for over an hour before it finally left for good. I didn't sleep at all that night. Every noise in the trees sounded like it was back again. Then there was the storm. I'd been assigned to a remote station with an old plywood cabin on the edge of the coast, meant to stay 2 nights and wait for the supply plane. A willow had started to build offshore. Cold, relentless wind that came screaming down from the mountains without pause. By nightfall it was a full 40 miles an hour, steady with gusts that shook the whole building. Loose pumice and gravel were being ripped from the beach and hurled against the walls, each impact sharp and violent. The sound was like constant static mixed with thunder. Inside, the air tasted like wood dust and salt. Every time the wind hit, the cabin flexed slightly, creaking as if the nails were slowly pulling free. I lay in the bunk wrapped in my sleeping bag, feeling each shockwave of wind hit the walls, imagining what it would be like if one panel tore loose. The storm lasted 2 full days, and by the end of it, every inch of the wood was scored with pale scratches from flying grit. When it finally calmed, the silence was so heavy it almost hurt to hear nothing at all. I thought I knew fear by then, but nothing quite matches crossing a glacial river with a 50-pound pack. The water is milky and gray, moving fast enough to hide its depth. The sound alone can drown out your thoughts. The cold hits like electricity the moment you step in, making it hard to breathe. You take slow, deliberate steps, knowing one slip can send you under where there's no coming back. The rocks shift beneath your boots, smooth and round and always moving. Every inch forward feels like it takes a minute. The pressure of the current pulling against your legs like it's trying to take you. By the time I made it across, my hands were shaking so badly I couldn't undo the straps of my pack for several minutes. But the worst moment of all came later, when I was flying back from a survey over one of the salmon streams. I was alone in the small single-engine plane, the world below spread out in endless green and white. The mountains looked soft from that height, like folded fabric, with ribbons of blue water cutting through. I'd been in the air for over an hour when the sound changed. It started as a small cough in the engine, just enough to make me glance at the fuel gauge. I'd miscalculated. The needle was sitting lower than I'd realized. The hum sputtered again, weaker this time, and then it stopped. The silence that followed was unbearable. The only sound was the wind rushing past the cockpit. My stomach dropped as the plane began to lose altitude, the horizon slowly tilting. I could see the tree line ahead, miles of rough country with no clearings big enough to land. I remember how the air felt suddenly warm and heavy, how the smell of fuel and oil filled the small space. I tried to keep my hands steady, trimming the glide, scanning for anything. An open riverbed, a gravel bar, even a wide stretch of tundra. The land rose too fast, and I could feel the ground rushing up at me. I aimed for a small bend in the river where the gravel looked firm. The impact was chaos. The right wing hit first, snapping with a sound like metal screaming. The nose slammed down, the glass shattered, and everything went white for a second. When it stopped, there was only the sound of the river and my own heartbeat hammering so loud I thought it might split my chest. I sat there for a long time, shaking, unable to move until I realized I was still alive. My legs hurt, my hands were bleeding, but I could still breathe. The plane was half buried in gravel, the smell of fuel thick in the air. I spent that night on the bank beside the wreck, wrapped in the emergency blanket, staring at the mountains turning black against the sky. Every sound out there felt sharper, closer. The rush of water, the faint rustle of wind through the trees, the distant cry of something wild. I'd faced bears, storms, cold, and rivers, but nothing ever made me feel smaller than that night, knowing how quickly it all could have ended. When the rescue chopper found me the next day, I could still hear the echo of that silence from when the engine died. The moment the world held its breath and reminded me just how thin the line is between control and nothing at all. When I was 13, my family decided to go camping in one of our favorite national parks a few hours away from home. We had gone there every year for as long as I could remember, always avoiding the official campgrounds and instead driving down the old logging roads to find our own private spots. Those hidden places felt wilder, untouched, like we were actually part of the woods instead of just visiting them. My dad liked the challenge of finding new locations each time, and that year, we found one that felt almost perfect. The spot was nestled between two ponds that mirrored each other, the hill in between them covered with pine needles and surrounded by tall trees. It felt quiet but not empty, alive in that peaceful, natural way. You could hear frogs croaking endlessly from both ponds, their overlapping calls filling the air from the moment the sun began to dip until well past midnight. The road that led there was rough, though. The deeper we went, the less it felt like a road at all. Grass grew tall between the tire tracks, and fallen branches and small hills forced us to slow to a crawl. Eventually, we had to stop completely because the car wasn't built for that kind of terrain. It didn't have four-wheel drive. So we packed what we could carry and walked the rest of the way, our boots sinking into soft dirt and dead leaves. It took nearly an hour to haul everything up that hill between the ponds. We set up 2 tents, one for my parents and one for me and my younger brother, then started a fire and cooked some food as the sky turned orange and pink through the trees. Everything felt calm that evening. The frogs were so loud it was almost soothing. They echoed from both sides, and when the wind shifted, it almost sounded like they were answering each other. After dinner, we sat around the fire until it burned low and then went to bed. The air was cool, and the smell of the damp woods made me fall asleep quickly. Somewhere around 2 a.m, I woke up. It wasn't the usual kind of waking where you toss and roll back over. It was that uneasy kind where something feels off before your mind catches up. I heard a deep rumbling sound, steady and mechanical, coming from somewhere down the road we'd walked in on. It grew louder and louder until it sounded like the ground itself was shaking. At first I thought maybe it was thunder, but then headlights flickered faintly through the trees, and I realized it was vehicles, big ones. 2 massive black trucks came roaring in, their tires crunching over the uneven ground like it was nothing. I remember how out of place they looked. Clean, newer trucks moving smoothly through that overgrown mess of a path that had taken us hours to walk. They didn't stop when they reached the clearing, just slowed down a bit, headlights off, then parked near the edge of one of the ponds. The engines died, and for a few seconds everything went quiet except for the frogs. Then one by one the truck doors opened. I expected flashlights or talking, something, but instead it was just silence. Maybe 8 or 10 men got out, dressed in dark clothes, moving like they'd done this before. No one said a word. No one even looked around. They started pulling out long-handled nets from the beds of their trucks, the kind used for scooping fish or pond samples. The sound of the metal poles scraping against the truck sides was the only real noise. Then they just walked straight into the water, boots and all, and began sweeping their nets through the pond. The strangest part was how coordinated they were. Each person moved a few feet from the next, skimming the nets along the surface and then lifting them out, dumping whatever they caught into large white coolers at the edge of the pond. Over and over, for more than an hour, they worked in total silence. No flashlights, no voices, no music, no light from phones, just dark figures wading knee-deep through the black water under the moonlight. From our tents, I could hear the faint splash of the nets and the quiet shifting of water. My heart was pounding because the whole thing felt wrong in a way I couldn't explain. They weren't acting like normal people you'd expect to find in the woods. Most people would say something, joke around, or at least nod to another group nearby. These men didn't even look at our camp. It was like we weren't there at all. After a while, the frogs started to quiet down. At first I thought maybe the sound was just blending into the background, but then I realized they were actually stopping. One by one, the croaks faded until both ponds were completely silent. The only noise left was the sloshing water from the men's boots and the occasional scrape of a cooler lid. Eventually, they finished. They carried their coolers back into the trucks, packed up, and drove off without a single word. The whole thing ended as suddenly as it started. The engines faded into the distance, and then there was nothing but stillness again. When I finally fell back asleep, it was uneasy. I kept waking up, waiting for the sound of trucks returning, but they didn't. When morning came, everything looked normal again except for the silence. The ponds that had been alive with noise the day before were completely quiet. We walked down to the edge and saw nothing moving in the water. No ripples, no flashes of frogs jumping away, just stillness. Then, near one of the muddy banks, we found a single frog with one of its legs bent awkwardly, like it had been caught and escaped. My dad picked it up carefully and placed it back in the shallow water, but even then it didn't make a sound. The rest of the trip felt strange. The forest around us was the same, but without that endless background of frog calls, it felt empty. The nights were too quiet, and I remember lying awake listening for any noise at all, half hoping to hear the frogs again, half dreading that the trucks might return. They never did. We went back to that park a few times over the years, sometimes camping in other spots, sometimes hiking near the old road. We saw the ponds again once, and they looked normal. Frogs had returned, but it never felt the same. The memory of those trucks stayed with me, that silent group of men taking something they shouldn't have needed to take. The next year we went camping in a different part of the park. It was a wide clearing surrounded by low trees and thick underbrush. We were more careful that time, but even then, something unexpected happened. Late one night, sometime before dawn, I woke up to the sound of scraping plastic. When I looked out of the tent, I saw a black bear dragging our cooler across the ground. It wasn't in any rush. It just waddled off into the trees, clutching the cooler like it owned it. In the morning, we found the cooler half crushed, a few beer cans flattened, and every marshmallow gone. That time, at least, it was something normal, something that made sense in the wild. Still, I never forgot that first night. The trucks, the nets, the sudden silence of the ponds. It was the kind of thing that sticks in your mind. Not because of what happened, but because of how unnatural it all felt. To this day, when I think about that place, I don't remember the stars or the campfire or even the bear. I remember the sound of the engines in the distance, the moonlight on the still water, and the way the frogs went quiet all at once, as if they knew something we didn't. I worked in Yellowstone one summer, mostly doing maintenance work and helping out with trail cleanups. It was one of those jobs that didn't pay much, but gave me a chance to live inside one of the most beautiful and unpredictable places on Earth. The days were long and filled with noise, tourists, traffic, radios, but the nights were something else entirely. Once the sun went down, the park changed. Everything became quieter, heavier, and darker in a way that never quite felt natural. The stars were incredible, but the dark spaces between them always felt endless. One night I had driven out to West Yellowstone for supplies and dinner. It was late when I started heading back into the park, probably close to midnight. The temperature had dropped fast, and a layer of fog clung to the road in low, rolling patches. The air smelled like pine and dust and something faintly metallic that always seemed to hang around after a long day of heat. I kept my window cracked and the radio low, mostly just to stay awake. The road into the park at that hour was almost completely empty. I hadn't seen another vehicle for miles. About 20 minutes after passing the entrance gate, my headlights caught something strange up ahead. At first it looked like steam, like heat coming off the road, but as I got closer, the shape became clearer. It was a car stopped right in the middle of the road, its headlights still on, the driver's side door open. A few seconds later, I saw the reason it had stopped. A massive bison was lying half on the pavement and half off, its body twisted in an unnatural way, its legs kicking faintly in the air. The front of the car was crushed inward, the hood bent like paper and the windshield shattered. The whole front end was smeared with dark fur and something that glistened in the headlights. I slowed to a crawl, pulling to the side of the road. The bison's chest rose and fell in short, shallow movements, its breath coming out in low, broken grunts. I remember how big it was, even dying there on the pavement. Massive, heavy, the kind of animal that could turn a car into scrap. Steam hissed from the crumpled hood of the sedan, and the smell of antifreeze mixed with the sharp iron scent of blood. The driver was nowhere to be seen. I looked toward the shoulder, half expecting to see someone standing there waving for help, but there was nothing. The only sound was the idling hum of my own engine and the slow, struggling breaths of the animal. I turned my headlights toward the trees for a moment, thinking maybe the driver had gone into the woods to look for cell service or to throw up from the shock. The forest was pitch black, just a wall of dark trunks and branches. My lights didn't even reach far before they were swallowed up. There was no movement anywhere. The open car door swayed slightly in the breeze, creaking faintly. On the ground beside it, I could see a single shoe lying upside down near the yellow line. A few small splashes of blood dotted the pavement nearby, but they stopped abruptly a few feet from the car, as if the person had walked off the road and vanished. I remember thinking that maybe they'd been picked up by another driver. It was possible. People stopped for each other out here all the time, but something about the scene felt wrong. The lights were still on, the keys were still in the ignition, and the radio was playing static. It didn't feel like someone had left calmly. I didn't have cell service that deep into the park, so I sat there for a few minutes, trying to figure out what to do. The bison made a long, low groan that echoed against the trees, and I could see its legs still twitching. I hated the idea of leaving it there, but there wasn't anything I could do for it or the driver. I knew there was a campground about 15 minutes up the road that had a payphone near the ranger station. That was my best option. The drive there felt longer than it should have. My headlights seemed weaker than usual, like the darkness was pressing in from every direction. Every time I went around a curve, I kept expecting to see someone stumbling out of the trees. Maybe the missing driver, maybe hurt, maybe delirious. But there was nothing. Just mile after mile of dark road and fog hanging low over the ground. When I finally reached the campground, I pulled into the lot and parked near the payphone. The place was mostly quiet except for a few faint sounds from tents and campers settling in for the night. The phone booth light buzzed weakly overhead, attracting a swarm of moths. I called the ranger station and told them what I'd found. The car, the bison, the missing driver. They said they'd send someone out to check right away. I stayed there for a while, sitting on the hood of my truck, staring into the darkness beyond the parking lot. Eventually, I decided to drive back toward my cabin, figuring there wasn't much else I could do. The next morning, I went by the ranger station again to ask what they'd found. The ranger on duty said they had located the car and the animal, but by the time they arrived, the driver had already been accounted for. Apparently, another motorist had picked them up and taken them to the clinic in West Yellowstone with minor injuries. That was the official word anyway. Still, there were details that never quite made sense to me. The ranger said they hadn't found any real blood trail near the scene, just a few drops and that one shoe. The car's hazard lights had been on when they got there, but I knew for a fact they hadn't been when I saw it. And the bison, they said, had already been dead when they arrived, though I'd watched it breathing myself. For the rest of that summer, every time I drove that stretch of road after dark, I'd slow down near that same bend. Even after the wreckage was cleared, I could still see the faint dark stain in the pavement where the bison had lain. Sometimes, when the fog was thick, my headlights would catch something in that spot. Just a shimmer. A shape that looked like a car door slightly open, or a flash of pale fabric on the road. Maybe it was just my mind replaying that night. It's been years since then, but I still think about it. I tell myself the driver made it out fine, that they got help and went home, and that everything ended normally. But every time I remember how silent that road was, how the forest just swallowed up the light and the sound, I get that same uneasy feeling. Out there, in a place as big and wild as Yellowstone, people vanish in the dark all the time. And sometimes, even when they come back, part of you still wonders what really happened in the minutes they were gone. It was the first morning of our week-long backpacking trip in Olympic National Park, and the air still had that damp, heavy chill that comes off the Pacific in early summer. The three of us, me, Kyle, and Ben, had left our cabins near Forks at dawn, packed tight in my old Subaru with our gear stacked to the roof. The forest road we were driving was narrow and uneven, a winding strip of dirt and gravel hemmed in by massive trees that blocked most of the early light. The deeper we drove into the park, the darker it got, the forest swallowing the morning sun. The only sounds were the crunch of tires over gravel and the occasional thump of gear shifting in the back. I could smell pine sap, wet earth, and the faint salt of ocean air that drifted in from miles away. We were all in that kind of quiet where you're not really thinking, just moving forward, waiting for the day to start. I remember leaning slightly over the wheel, focusing on the next bend, my headlights flickering against the trunks of redwoods and cedars. It felt endless. Mile after mile of tight forest road, the kind that made you feel small. Then out of nowhere, the bushes ahead exploded. It wasn't just movement. It was violent, like something had been fired out of the woods. A black bear burst out of the trees and landed square in front of the car. I barely had time to hit the brake. My body jerked forward, and for a second I thought we were going to hit it. The bear was enormous, easily 300 pounds, its fur thick and slick from the morning dew, its muscles moving under its skin like waves. It hit the road, turned hard, and sprinted straight up it right in front of us. At first I didn't even process what I was seeing. It was surreal. This massive animal running full stride on the same road we were driving. I glanced at the speedometer. We were doing 25, maybe 30. The bear was accelerating faster than the car could. I could feel my foot lighten on the gas, just watching in disbelief as it pulled away. The bear's run didn't look real. It wasn't clumsy or lumbering like you'd expect from something that size. Its paws barely seemed to touch the ground. The power in its legs was unreal. It moved like a machine built purely for speed. The way its shoulders rolled with each stride, the sound of its claws scraping the gravel, the way its back arched and straightened in rhythm. It was like watching something primal, something that didn't belong on the same scale as humans. The car's engine hummed quietly under the strain of the climb, and still the bear widened the gap, vanishing for a second around the next bend before bursting back into sight as the road straightened. I realized my hands were locked on the wheel, my chest tight, and I hadn't taken a breath in a while. I couldn't hear anything from the guys behind me. We were all frozen in the same stunned silence. Then the bear did something that burned itself into my memory. It turned its head, not fully, just enough to look over its shoulder at us. It wasn't fear in that glance. It wasn't even anger. It was like it was making a point, showing us exactly where we stood in the order of things. The black of its eyes caught the light for a split second, and I swear I could see the reflection of the car in them. Just a small metal box trying to keep up with something that belonged to the wild. Then it veered off the road in one clean, effortless motion. It didn't slow down, didn't stumble, just angled itself toward the tree line and disappeared back into the brush like it had never been there. The forest swallowed it up completely. There wasn't a sound afterward, just the fading echo of gravel settling and the low hum of the car idling. I remember stopping right where it had gone in. The roadside was dense with ferns and salal, the ground littered with needles and rotting branches. The path the bear had taken was still visible, a fresh gap in the brush, broken leaves still trembling where it had crashed through. I could see where its paws had torn small divots into the dirt and how deep they sank. The size of them was unreal. Each print looked like it could fit a dinner plate. We sat there for a long minute before I rolled forward again, slowly this time, my eyes flicking between the road and the woods. The feeling that lingered wasn't just shock, it was something else, something deeper. It was the kind of moment that quietly rearranges the way you see things. Before that morning, a black bear had just been an animal to me. Something to be careful of, sure, but still part of the scenery of being outdoors. After that, I understood that they weren't part of our world at all. We were part of theirs, moving through it on borrowed time. The rest of that drive to the campsite felt different. Every shadow between the trees looked alive. Every rustle made me tighten my grip on the steering wheel. I could still see the way that bear ran, The weight, the speed, the power that felt completely effortless. I kept thinking about how fast it had pulled away from a car doing 30 miles an hour. If it had been running toward us instead of away, there would have been nothing we could have done. It could have been on top of us before we even registered it. When we finally reached the campsite, we got out quietly. The woods around us were still and thick, the kind of quiet that pressed down on you. I looked down the narrow dirt road we had come from, but it was empty, the sunlight filtering through in broken beams. You wouldn't have known anything had happened there, not a single trace left behind, but I couldn't shake the image, the black blur of that animal disappearing into the green. That night, as we set up camp and the sky faded to a dull gray, the sounds of the forest seemed louder than usual. The distant cracking of branches, the soft shuffle of something in the brush, the faint thump of a bird landing on a branch, they all carried weight. Every small sound made me glance toward the trees. I wasn't afraid exactly, but there was a kind of awareness that didn't fade. I knew now, in a way I hadn't before, that the forest wasn't just a backdrop. It was alive, and everything in it moved with a purpose that didn't include us. When I finally lay down that night, I could still picture that moment when the bear looked back. It was quick, less than a second, but it said everything. It wasn't running from me. It was showing me that if it wanted to, it could have done whatever it wanted, and there would have been nothing I could do. That's the part that stuck with me. The realization that what we call the wild isn't just untamed. It's something beyond control, something that doesn't care about who you are or what you think you know. People always talk about how beautiful Olympic National Park is, how peaceful it feels. And it is in its way. But that morning showed me the other side of it. The quiet isn't peace. It's the kind of silence that hides power. The kind that reminds you you're just a guest. When I think back to that bear running up the road faster than a car, I remember the raw strength in its movement and how small it made everything else feel. It wasn't anger or violence that scared me. It was how natural it all looked. That kind of speed, that kind of force wasn't being shown off. It just was. And that's the thing I'll never forget. You can hike, camp, and drive through places like that and think you're part of it. But you're not. You're just passing through, hoping you don't cross paths with something that reminds you how fragile you really are. That bear did. It didn't have to chase us or threaten us. It just had to run. And in that short stretch of forest road, it made its point clear enough for the rest of my life. People, it's always people. That thought crossed my mind a lot when I was hiking alone in the backcountry. It wasn't the wildlife or the weather that really made my heart race sometimes. It was the quiet and the sudden reminder that someone else might be out there with me. There's something about being deep in the woods where the rules of normal life don't really apply anymore. Civilization feels far away, and the idea of safety feels like something you left behind miles ago. That day, I was 3 days into a solo backpacking trip in the mountains of western Montana. I'd planned it for months, tracing the route on maps and marking water sources and campsites. The weather was perfect. Crisp mornings, dry air, and clear blue skies that made the ridges look endless. The trail twisted through a mix of lodgepole pine and aspen, sometimes opening up to small meadows filled with wildflowers. The silence out there was the kind that rings in your ears after a while. The kind that makes you hyper-aware of every sound your boots make on the dirt. I hadn't seen another person since the previous afternoon, and I liked it that way. It was late morning when I first noticed something strange. I'd stopped to take a drink from a small creek and noticed footprints in the soft mud on the bank. They weren't mine. I could see the tread was different, wider, heavier. Someone had crossed not long ago, maybe within the past couple of hours. That wasn't alarming by itself. It was a public trail after all, but I hadn't passed anyone all morning, and based on the direction of the prints, they were heading the same way I was. That meant whoever it was had to be just ahead of me, yet the trail was quiet and I hadn't seen or heard anyone. I started walking again, slower this time. The woods felt different, heavier. Every once in a while I'd think I heard something, a branch snap, a faint shuffle, but the sound stopped when I stopped. I kept reminding myself that it was probably just the forest playing tricks. Animals, wind, my own footsteps echoing off the trees. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone else was out there. Around noon, I reached a narrow section of the trail that followed a ridge. From up there, I could see the valley below, thick with trees and a small river winding through. As I hiked, I caught a flash of movement ahead, something pale moving between the trees. My first thought was another hiker. Relief and tension mixed in me. I'd been alone long enough that even seeing another person felt strange. I sped up a little, thinking maybe I'd catch up, maybe talk for a bit. But when I reached the spot, there was no one there. The trail dipped into a shaded grove and the air felt cooler. I stopped to listen. Nothing. Just the wind and the leaves. After that, I started noticing small things that didn't make sense. A broken trekking pole leaning against a tree. A blue tarp half buried under some leaves. A cigarette butt near the edge of the trail. None of it was fresh, but none of it looked weathered either. I hadn't seen a single campsite since morning, yet it felt like someone had been moving through here, leaving pieces of themselves behind. By late afternoon, the sun was dipping behind the mountains, and the light turned that deep golden color that makes everything look peaceful, but also slightly unreal. I set up camp in a small clearing near a creek. The place looked untouched. No fire rings, no trash, just soft pine needles and the faint hum of running water. I ate a quick meal and stretched out on my sleeping pad, watching the light fade. The forest around me settled into its nighttime rhythm, but I couldn't relax. The feeling of being watched had settled deep into me, not sharp like fear, but steady and heavy. When it got dark, I turned off my headlamp and lay still, listening. The sound of the creek helped for a while. But then I heard something else, footsteps, slow, steady, crunching over the dry needles. They stopped every few seconds, like whoever it was kept pausing to listen. My chest tightened. I didn't move, didn't breathe. The footsteps came closer, maybe 30 feet away, then stopped completely. I waited, eyes wide, heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. After a few minutes, the sound of movement faded. Whoever it was had walked away. I stayed awake most of the night, listening for it again, but the woods were silent. When the sky finally started to lighten, I packed up quickly and hit the trail before sunrise. I told myself I'd just imagined it. That sound carries strangely in the woods, that maybe it had been an elk or a deer. But part of me didn't believe that. I hiked fast, barely stopping to rest. By mid-morning, I reached another stream crossing, and that's when I saw them again. Footprints. Fresh ones. The same tread pattern I'd seen the day before. But this time there was another set beside them. Mine. Someone had been following me. I could see it clearly in the mud. My prints were underneath in some places, and theirs were on top, slightly fresher. The realization hit me so hard I just stood there staring. Whoever it was had been behind me, close enough to follow my exact route. I didn't waste time after that. I pushed hard for the trailhead, barely stopping to drink. My legs burned, my shoulders ached from the pack, but the fear kept me moving. Every sound in the woods felt magnified. The call of a bird made me flinch. A falling branch made my heart race. I kept glancing back, half expecting to see someone step onto the trail behind me. But there was never anyone there. When I finally reached the parking lot that afternoon, my car was the only one there. The whole place was silent except for the wind moving through the trees. I dropped my pack in the dirt and just stood there, staring down the empty road. There was no sign of anyone else. No other vehicles, no voices, no movement. Just that feeling in my gut that I hadn't really been alone out there. Before I left, I checked the trail register near the signpost. It was the kind where hikers write their names and dates for safety. I flipped back through the pages until I found the day I started. Only 2 entries, mine and another name written in shaky handwriting. The same date just a few hours before me. I looked at it for a long time. There was no exit date next to it. No signature saying they'd made it out. Driving down the mountain, I kept thinking about how easy it is to forget what isolation really means. Out there, the normal rules don't matter. You can scream and no one will hear you. You can disappear and it'll take days before anyone even realizes. It's not the mountains or the animals that make the wilderness dangerous. It's the people you don't see but somehow know are there. And the worst part is sometimes you never find out who they were or how close they really got. I've worked as a park ranger for almost 10 years, and if there's one thing that job teaches you, it's that the scariest things out there aren't animals, or weather, or ghosts. It's people, and the unpredictable things they do when they think no one is watching. This happened back in 2018, when I was stationed at a national forest in northern Idaho. It was a quiet park, mostly used by hunters and long-distance hikers, with stretches of forest so deep you could walk for hours and never hear another sound besides your own boots and the wind. My shift that month was a long solo rotation, covering the backcountry campsites, making sure fire pits were cold, and checking that no one was camping outside the designated zones. It was the kind of work that left you alone with your thoughts for hours at a time, and I used to like that. One morning I left the ranger station around 7:30 a.m., driving the old green park truck down a dirt service road that wound up into the mountains. It had rained the night before and the air still smelled of wet pine and mud. I had a list of sites to check, mostly basic stuff: fire ring inspections, trail erosion, clearing fallen branches. I was scheduled to check a primitive camping area called Bluff Hollow, about 12 miles from the main trailhead. It was one of those tucked-away spots that only the most determined campers ever reached. The kind of place that made you feel like you were the last person left on Earth. I parked the truck by the trail entrance and started hiking up. The first part of the trail was steep but well-marked, and I remember hearing the rush of a nearby creek as I climbed. After about an hour, the forest started to close in tighter. The trees grew taller, older, and the sunlight got dimmer the deeper I went. I didn't see any footprints, no trash, no fresh signs of campers. The place felt completely untouched. About halfway up, I noticed something off. A faint path cutting away from the main trail, heading toward the creek. It wasn't on the map, but it looked recently used. The dirt was packed down in narrow lines, like boot tracks that had been rained on but not washed away completely. I probably should have just noted it for later and kept going, but curiosity got the better of me. I followed the side path for maybe 100 yards, pushing through ferns and brush until the ground leveled out into a small clearing by the water. At first glance, it looked empty. Then I saw it, a half-collapsed tent lying near the tree line, the fabric sagging and torn. Next to it was a small pile of gear, a backpack, a plastic food container, an empty water bottle. Everything looked like it had been there for a while, maybe a week or two. I walked closer and knelt by the tent. Inside were a few things that didn't sit right with me. A pair of muddy boots, a rolled-up sleeping bag that was still damp, and an old metal cooking pot filled halfway with rainwater. Whoever had camped there had left in a hurry or never came back. There wasn't a fire ring, which was unusual and no sign of a struggle, but the tent's zipper was open and the whole setup felt wrong. Like someone had been interrupted in the middle of packing. I took out my notebook, wrote down the coordinates, and started to backtrack to the main trail when I caught another odd thing. A faint smell, something sour and chemical, drifting from farther downstream. It wasn't natural. I followed it along the creek bank, stepping over rocks and logs until I reached a spot where the water slowed into a small pool. That's where I found the second thing that made my stomach drop. In the mud at the edge of the pool was a half-buried blue tarp, weighed down with stones. I pulled a corner loose with my boot, and underneath it were several black trash bags tied tight. The smell hit me so hard I gagged. I didn't need to open them to know something was seriously wrong. The scent wasn't just rot, and it was decay. I froze there for a long minute, trying to figure out what to do. My radio was clipped to my belt, but reception in that valley was garbage. I backed up, trying not to leave any fresh prints near the tarp, and headed uphill to higher ground until I finally got a signal. I reported what I'd found, gave coordinates, and was told to stay put until backup arrived. That was the longest wait of my life. It took almost 2 hours before another ranger and a county deputy made it up the trail. By then I'd set up a perimeter with flagging tape and sat on a rock staring into the trees, feeling like every sound was a person watching me. When the others arrived, we went back down to the creek together. The deputy opened one of the bags while I stood a few feet away. Inside were what looked like strips of old clothing and something pale beneath them. I couldn't bring myself to look closer. They called for detectives, and soon the whole area was sealed off. The investigation stretched for weeks. Eventually, the news reached us that the remains belonged to a missing person from Montana, a man who'd been reported gone 6 months earlier. He'd apparently been camping somewhere in the forest, though no one knew exactly why. The official report said he was likely killed by another person he met on the trail, someone who had vanished completely afterward. No suspect, no witnesses, no closure. I still had to finish out the season after that. For months, I couldn't stop thinking about that tent, that tarp, that quiet valley. Every time I hiked alone, I caught myself glancing behind me, checking the shadows between the trees. Before, I used to think the woods were peaceful, that kind of deep, natural quiet that clears your head. After that day, silence stopped feeling peaceful. It started feeling like something holding its breath. The next spring, I went back to Bluff Hollow with another ranger. The tent, the tarp. Everything had been cleared out long ago, but I could still see the faint indentations in the soil where it all had been. The creek ran clear again, the forest green and calm as if nothing had ever happened there. I don't scare easily anymore, but I also don't trust the idea of empty places. You never really know what's out there, or what's been buried just out of sight. Whenever I see someone hiking alone, I always feel that little twist in my gut, not because I think something will happen to them, but because I know what can. Every now and then, I still get sent to check that same trail. I do my job, note the erosion, clear the fallen branches, make sure the fire pits are cold, but I never take that side path again. I pass it every time, just a narrow line disappearing into the brush, and I keep walking. I don't need to see what's waiting down there. Once was enough. It was late September of 2018 when I was stationed at Pine Hollow National Forest in northern Colorado. I was 32 at the time, had been a park ranger for almost 7 years, and thought I'd seen just about everything the wilderness could throw at me. Stranded hikers, small brush fires, animal encounters, even a few missing persons cases that thankfully ended well. But there was one incident that still bothers me whenever I'm alone out in the woods. It wasn't anything supernatural or mysterious. It was something that showed me how far people can go when no one's watching. That week I was working the late patrols, covering the eastern boundary of the park. It's a rough area. Long stretches of dirt roads, old campgrounds that hardly anyone uses anymore, and no cell service for miles. The terrain is all rolling pine ridges, dried creek beds, and thick patches of scrub oak. During that time of year, the forest looks dry and tired. The air carries that faint, burnt smell of fallen pine needles baking in the sun. My job that night was simple. Drive down the service road to check the fire rings at 3 old camp zones, make sure no one left hot embers behind, and verify the trail cameras that were used to track wildlife activity. It was one of those dull routines, the kind of work you can do half asleep if you've done it enough times. I signed out the truck around 5 p.m., threw in a thermos of coffee, and set off. By 6:30, I reached the first site, Juniper Ridge Camp. No one there, just an empty picnic table and an old fire ring surrounded by beer cans. I cleaned it up, checked the ashes, cold them, and noted it in my log. The forest around me was quiet, that kind of dead silence that comes just before dusk. Only the wind was moving, whispering through the pines. I could already feel the temperature starting to drop. The second stop, Bear Meadow, was about 12 miles down the road. It was one of the original camping spots from back when the park opened in the 1970s, but it had been closed for almost 5 years due to maintenance issues. The road was full of potholes and weeds grew through cracks in the asphalt. When I got there, I found tire tracks in the dirt, fresh ones. That immediately stood out since technically no one was allowed in that area anymore. I parked, grabbed my flashlight, and followed the tracks down a narrow path that cut through the pines. It led toward the old campsite clearing. As soon as I got close, I saw signs that someone had been staying there. There was a tarp stretched between 2 trees, a small fire pit still smoldering, and a cooler with the lid open. It wasn't unusual to find people camping illegally, especially hunters during the off-season. But what bothered me was how recent everything looked. The ashes were warm, the ground around the tarp was trampled, and there were food wrappers scattered around like someone left in a hurry. I checked for any sign of the person. Maybe they'd gone for a walk or were packing up nearby. but the forest was empty. I called it in through my radio, though I knew reception here was spotty. Static, then nothing. I decided to document everything and move on, figuring I'd come back with another ranger in the morning. But before I left, I noticed something odd near the fire pit. There was a shallow hole about the size of a small backpack, freshly dug. The dirt was still damp, the kind of dark, turned-up soil you can smell even before you get close. Curiosity got the better of me, so I knelt down and brushed some of the loose dirt aside. Underneath were scraps of black plastic like trash bags. I tugged one corner of it and the smell hit me. It wasn't the smell of rot exactly, more like something chemical, sharp and sour. I didn't open it further. I just covered it back up. I remember thinking it was probably animal remains or spoiled food, but something about how neatly it had been buried didn't sit right. Most campers wouldn't bother burying garbage that way. I decided to check the trail cameras nearby. There was one mounted about 40 yards up the slope on an old pine. I climbed up to it, pulled the memory card, and pocketed it. I had a few more stops that night, but something in my gut told me to head back to the station instead. On the drive out, the forest grew darker, faster than usual. The road wound through long stretches where the trees leaned in from both sides, their tops forming a tunnel of black branches. I kept scanning the sides of the road with my spotlight, habit mostly, and that's when I caught something in the beam. It was a figure standing beside a tree, about 100 feet off the road. They weren't moving, just standing there facing the truck. I slowed down, thinking maybe it was a hunter or lost hiker. I stopped for a second to get a better look, but when I aimed the light back, they were gone. I didn't hear any movement, no crunching leaves or snapping twigs. Just gone. That drive back felt longer than usual. My hands were tight on the wheel, my stomach turning a little from that strange chemical smell that still lingered on my gloves. When I finally got back to the ranger station, it was past 10 p.m. I dropped off the keys, logged my notes, and went straight to the office computer to check that memory card. Most of the photos were the usual: deer, raccoons, the occasional fox. But around 3 a.m. the previous night, one image caught my attention. It showed a man standing in the same clearing I'd just been in. He was facing the camera, wearing a dark jacket, head down like he didn't know it was there. The timestamp showed he'd been there for several nights in a row. The strange part was what he was holding. It wasn't a hunting rifle or camping gear. It looked like a shovel. The next morning, I returned with another ranger and 2 deputies. We dug up the buried hole completely this time. Inside the black plastic was a dead dog, or what was left of one. Its collar had been cut off, and there were signs it had been there for a while. Nearby, we found another shallow pit already started, and beside it, a small duffel bag filled with rope, duct tape, and 2 large knives. They never caught the man from the photo. We sent the pictures to local law enforcement, checked nearby campsites, ran license plates from cars parked at trailheads. Nothing. Whoever he was, he'd vanished into the woods. For weeks after that, I couldn't stop thinking about that night. The smell, the footprints, the figure watching from the trees. I still patrol that area sometimes, but I never go alone anymore. There's something about knowing that while most people come to the forest for peace or beauty, some come for reasons that don't make sense. The wilderness hides things well. It hides people too. And out there, away from the rules and eyes of anyone else, you start to realize how thin that line really is between calm and danger, between doing your job and stumbling onto something you were never supposed to see. I worked as a seasonal park ranger in northern Idaho in 2013. It was my second summer at Bitterroot National Forest, and by then I'd gotten used to the routine: early mornings, long drives along dirt roads, checking campsites, monitoring trails, writing reports. The area I covered was huge, mostly forest and old mining land with a few remote lakes that drew fishermen and backpackers. Some of those lakes were a solid 2-hour drive from the nearest paved road, and that's not counting the hike-in. One of those was called Morrison Lake. It wasn't anything spectacular, just a deep, cold body of water tucked into a steep valley, but people liked it because it was quiet and stocked with trout. There was an old fire access trail that led in, and the last mile had to be done on foot because the road had washed out years ago. That summer it was assigned to me for weekly patrols. I'd go up every Friday to check the site, make sure no one had trashed it or left fires burning. Usually I didn't see anyone for miles. The first time that summer I went to Morrison. It was early June. Everything looked normal, just trees, still patches of snow in the shade, the smell of pine and wet dirt. I stayed a while, logged my notes, and headed back out. The next week, though, things felt different right away. About halfway in, I noticed a small pile of trash, beer cans, a plastic tarp, and a burned-out camp stove, dumped right beside the road. That always set me off. People drive all the way into the backcountry and then do that. I cleaned it up, loaded the mess into the truck bed, and kept going. When I reached the washed-out section, I parked, grabbed my pack, and started walking the last mile. It was hot that day, quiet except for the sound of flies and the creak of trees. Near the end of the trail, I came across fresh tire tracks in the mud. They were from a dirt bike or maybe an ATV. That trail had a locked gate miles back and only staff had keys. That meant someone had broken in or gone around through the trees. At the lake, I saw a small camp still standing on the far side, blue tent, cooler, and a fire pit ringed with rocks. No one was there, but the fire had been used recently and there were fresh footprints in the mud. I checked the tent. Inside was some gear, sleeping bag, a jacket, food wrappers, and a small propane lantern. Nothing illegal, just left behind. I figured whoever it was might have gone fishing or hiking. I wrote a note on an orange tag and left it on a tree. Park notice, clean up your site, report to the station. Then I hiked back to the truck. I didn't think much of it until 2 weeks later when I went up again and saw that same tent still standing there, in the exact same place. No sign of anyone. The fire pit was full of ash, but it looked like it hadn't been touched since the last time I was there. The food wrappers were the same too. What got me, though, was the smell, something rotten and sour. I checked the cooler and found a pack of meat, gray and moldy, covered with flies. It had probably been left out for days. I packed up the trash and took down the tent. I was halfway sure whoever owned it wasn't coming back. Later that week, a call came into our office from the sheriff's department. Someone's brother had gone missing in the forest. His truck had been found near the Morrison access road. I remember feeling that slow, heavy dread settle in my stomach when I heard the name. The man was about 30, an experienced camper. Last seen heading out alone with a fishing rod and a small tent. I told the deputy I'd already found that site and cleaned it up. He asked me to meet them out there the next morning. When we went back together, there were 4 of us, me, a deputy, a search coordinator, and another ranger. We parked near the washout and hiked in. Everything looked the same. The tent was gone now because I'd packed it out, but we searched the area anyway. The ground was soft enough to see old footprints all leading toward the lake. No return tracks. We followed the shore, found some fishing line tangled in reeds and a small tackle box sitting open near a boulder. That was it. No signs of a struggle, no body, nothing. The search dragged on for a week. They brought in dogs, drones, even divers for the lake. Nothing. The man had simply vanished. The family eventually pulled back the search, and it was treated as a missing person case with no resolution. I couldn't stop thinking about it, though, especially because I'd seen that site weeks before it was reported. I went back one last time near the end of July just to check things myself. That day was cloudy, the air thick and humid. I remember how still it was when I parked. No wind, no birds, just that heavy forest silence that feels wrong. I started walking in, slower than usual. About halfway down the trail, I noticed something new, a narrow side path leading off into the trees. It hadn't been there earlier that summer. The brush had been pushed down by boots or tires, and it looked like someone had walked it recently. I followed it just to see. After about 100 yards, it opened into a small clearing I'd never seen before. There were old mining leftovers there, rusted barrels, a collapsed shack, and a pit full of scrap metal. The ground was torn up like someone had been digging. I saw where a section of earth had caved in, exposing dark soil and a bit of canvas. I thought it was a tarp until I got closer. It wasn't a tarp, it was part of that same blue tent buried under dirt. My chest went tight when I realized what I was looking at. The smell hit next, unmistakable even after all that time. I called it in right away. The deputies came back with forensic crews. They spent hours digging. By nightfall, they confirmed what I already knew. It was the missing camper. They figured he'd fallen or been dragged into that pit. But the part that didn't sit right with me was how the tent got buried over him, and the dirt packed so neatly. It looked deliberate, not accidental. Someone had covered it, but there were no tools nearby, no tracks left fresh enough to help. They never found any suspects. The official report listed the cause as undetermined. Maybe an accident, maybe foul play. No one knew. I kept replaying the timeline in my head, how I'd seen that camp before the man was reported missing, how the tent was still up weeks later, how it ended up buried in a place that wasn't even visible from the main trail. The more I thought about it, the more it seemed like he wasn't alone out there. After that summer, I didn't go back to Bitterroot. I transferred to a different district down south, closer to town. Sometimes I still think about that pit, about the quietness of that trail, about how easy it is for something or someone to disappear out there. People always imagine the wilderness as this big, empty, peaceful place. But after enough years in it, you realize it's not the wilderness that's dangerous. It's the people who go there and never come back. I worked as a seasonal park ranger at a large national forest in northern Montana back in 2014. I was 29 at the time, still fairly new to the job, and eager to make a good impression. Most of my assignments were routine, checking campsites, maintaining trail signs, cleaning up trash. But every now and then, I'd get assigned solo patrols in the deeper parts of the park, the ones most people never visit unless they're serious backpackers. Those were the shifts that really tested you, not because of wildlife or weather, but because of how quiet it could get. When you spend long stretches of time that far out, you start noticing how fragile it feels to be human in a place that doesn't care whether you exist or not. This particular story took place in late September. It was the shoulder season, too cold for casual campers, too early for snow. The park was mostly empty. My supervisor had assigned me to check a cluster of backcountry campsites near an old service road that hadn't been used in years. It was a 2-day job. The plan was to hike about 15 miles in, inspect 3 remote sites, then stay overnight at an old ranger cabin before heading back the next morning. Nothing unusual. I started around noon. The air was dry, thin, and cool. The trail wound through thick pine and aspen forest, the ground soft with layers of fallen needles. I kept a steady pace, stopping every now and then to mark trail conditions. Around the 3rd hour, I noticed the forest start to thin out. The terrain sloped downward into a wide basin filled with waist-high grass and a few scattered spruce. It was eerily quiet. Normally you'd hear birds or the sound of wind in the canopy. But in that basin, it felt muted, like the air was too still. I reached the first campsite around 4 p.m. It was in good shape. Just an old fire ring, and a few logs someone had once used as benches. I wrote my notes, took a few photos, and kept going. The next site was about 3 miles further. The sun was already dipping low when I arrived. That's when I noticed the first odd thing. Fresh tracks. Not animal tracks, but human boot prints deep in the soft soil, like someone had passed through within the last day or so. I checked the logbook that hikers are supposed to sign at each site, but there was nothing written for weeks. I didn't think much of it at first. Sometimes hunters or drifters cut through without checking in. But the thing that bothered me was the direction of the prints. They came from deeper in the forest away from the trail. That area didn't lead anywhere except a section of dense, tangled woods that was nearly impossible to hike through. I took a picture of the prints for record and moved on. The last site was about 2 hours away. The forest grew darker and thicker as I moved along. The trail was narrow and uneven, and I could smell damp moss and old wood. Every sound carried far. The creak of branches, the crunch of my boots, the faint ticking of cooling metal from my pack frame. Around sunset, I came across something else. Off to the right of the trail, about 30 feet away, there was a small clearing. In the middle of it was a half-collapsed tent. The fabric was faded and torn, and part of it had been buried under fallen branches. It didn't look recent. I stepped closer and saw that the tent still had a few belongings inside. A rusted camping stove, an old lantern, and a sleeping bag that was half pulled out like someone had left in a hurry. The weirdest part was how untouched it looked otherwise. No sign of animals tearing through it, no weather damage that matched the age. It was like it had just been forgotten. I jotted down the GPS coordinates and decided I'd radio it in once I reached the cabin. By the time I got there, it was almost dark. The old ranger cabin was one of those hand-built log structures from the 1940s, barely holding together but still dry inside. It sat beside a narrow creek that made a constant soft rushing sound. I swept out the dust, set up my sleeping bag, and got a small fire going in the stove. There was no cell signal that deep in the forest, but the cabin had a mounted two-way radio for emergencies. When I tried to use it, the signal cracked and faded, typical for that far out. I ate a cold meal from my pack and noted the details of the day. Trail conditions good, sites maintained, found abandoned tent, possible unregistered hiker in area. Then I stretched out in my bag and listened to the night sounds. Around midnight, I woke up. I didn't know what woke me exactly. Maybe it was the way the creek sounded, too quiet, like the flow had slowed. I sat up and listened. There was a faint crunch of something outside, maybe 10 or 15 feet from the cabin. I waited, trying to decide if it was an animal. But the sound came again, slow and deliberate, like footsteps. I told myself it was probably a deer, but it didn't feel right. Deer don't move like that. They're lighter, more uneven. This was steady, one step at a time, circling the cabin. I stayed still for a long time, gripping my flashlight. The footsteps stopped after a while, and I eventually dozed off again. When I stepped outside at dawn, the first thing I noticed were the prints. Boot prints, same pattern as the ones from the second campsite, leading right up to the side of the cabin and back toward the woods. Whoever it was had been out there watching. I packed up quickly. On the hike back, I kept checking over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone following me. Every snapped twig made my stomach tighten. When I reached the spot where I'd seen the collapsed tent, I decided to take a closer look before leaving. But when I got there, the tent was gone. Not torn apart, not scattered, and gone. Just a faint rectangle of flattened grass where it had been. That's when I knew whoever had been walking around the cabin must have come back and packed it up. I checked the area carefully and found drag marks in the soil leading toward the direction of the old service road. A long, shallow trail, like someone had pulled the whole thing out with a rope. I didn't stop again until I reached the ranger station just before noon. I told my supervisor everything, the footprints, the abandoned tent, the noises at night. They sent a small team to check the area the next day. When they came back, they told me they found nothing. No tent, no tracks, not even a sign of anyone being there. A few weeks later, one of the senior rangers told me quietly that a missing person report from a hiker had been filed about 8 years earlier near that same basin. The hiker had been traveling alone and was last seen heading toward that section of the forest. They never found his camp, just a single boot and part of a frame pack miles away. After that, I avoided that route. Every ranger has a place they don't like to patrol alone, and that became mine. I still think about those prints circling the cabin, the missing tent, the silent basin where the air felt heavy and wrong. Out there, far from everything, you realize how thin the line is between being safe and just being lucky enough that no one else decides to step out of the trees. It was the summer of 2017, when I was working as a seasonal park ranger in Montana, assigned to the northern part of the Gallatin National Forest. I was 29 at the time, still fairly new to the job, eager to prove myself, and proud to be out there alone most days, managing trails, checking campsites, and keeping an eye on the backcountry areas that tourists rarely visited. That kind of solitude always appealed to me. It was peaceful, and the silence of the mountains made me feel grounded. But there's a certain kind of silence out there that starts to wear on you if you're out long enough. The kind that makes you realize how far from help you really are. That summer was unusually dry. Fires were always a concern, so part of my duties included inspecting old, unofficial campsites to make sure people hadn't been lighting fires where they shouldn't. The trails were dusty and soft underfoot, and every time I stopped walking I could hear nothing but the wind in the trees and the faint crackle of branches baking in the sun. One morning, I was assigned to check a section of backcountry that hadn't seen much traffic that year. A narrow stretch near the edge of the park boundary known as Dead Horse Ridge. The name always made visitors curious, but the reality was simple. Years ago, a pack horse fell off the ridge and the name just stuck. The area had no real trails, just game paths and a few markers left by older rangers. I loaded up my pack, filled my canteen, and set off early, planning to be out for most of the day. About 5 miles in, the forest started changing. The trees grew closer together, the undergrowth thicker. It wasn't an area many hikers would bother with. Too overgrown, no scenic lookouts, and a long way from the nearest campground. The air felt heavy and damp even though it hadn't rained in weeks. I remember thinking how strange it was that there were no bird calls, no insects buzzing around me. Just the creak of trees rubbing against each other in the breeze. I kept pushing forward until I found an old, disused fire ring made of stones blackened from old use. There were bits of metal scattered around, the burnt remains of cans maybe from hunters years back. I made notes in my logbook about it, planning to dismantle it later, then followed what looked like an old trail leading further uphill. After about another hour, I noticed boot prints in the dust. Fresh ones. Not old, not weathered. They were from hiking boots leading up toward the ridge. My first thought was that maybe someone had ignored the closures and wandered into the restricted area. I didn't see any sign of vehicles nearby, though, and that bothered me a bit. The access road was at least 4 miles back. Whoever it was had come a long way on foot. The footprints continued for about half a mile, then stopped at a clearing, an open space with grass waist-high, surrounded by trees that bent inward, almost forming a ring. There was a faint smell of something burnt. In the middle of the clearing was a small tent. Old faded blue fabric. It looked like it had been there for weeks. I approached slowly, noting the silence again. There were no birds, no movement in the grass. I called out and no answer. I walked around the tent and saw a small backpack beside it, torn open with food wrappers scattered. There were animal claw marks on one of the corners. Probably raccoons, maybe a bear. But what caught my attention was how the sleeping bag inside the tent was still rolled up, zipped tight and perfectly clean. No one had been sleeping in it. Then I noticed something else in the small black notebook lying near the fire ring. Its cover was damp from dew, but the pages were filled with writing, almost every line written in the same hurried scrawl. The entries weren't dated, but they mentioned voices in the woods, a man watching from the tree line, and footsteps circling the tent at night. I remember feeling my stomach drop. That kind of paranoia usually meant either someone was severely sleep-deprived or they weren't in their right mind. I looked around for any sign of the camper, a name, ID, even a clue of when they'd last been there. I didn't find any. Just a knife, a half-empty water bottle, and some unopened canned food. Everything else was too neat, like they'd planned to leave and just never did. I marked the location on my GPS and radioed in that I'd found an abandoned campsite. The nearest ranger station was 2 hours away by ATV, and radio reception in that area was poor, so I didn't get a reply right away. I decided to do a wider sweep, just to be sure the person wasn't nearby. As I moved deeper into the trees, I found more strange signs. A pair of torn hiking pants hanging from a low branch. A trail of boot prints that seemed to go in circles, doubling back on themselves. At one point I thought I heard something. A faint metallic sound like someone tapping metal against metal. I froze and waited, but it didn't come again. I tried to brush it off as a branch or my own gear shifting. By late afternoon I still hadn't found anything. I made my way back to the tent only to realize something that still chills me. The tent door, which had been closed when I first found it, was now open. I knew for a fact I hadn't unzipped it. I just stood there for a while, staring at it, trying to make sense of how that could happen. There was no wind strong enough to move it, and it wasn't on a slope. I forced myself to check inside again. Nothing had changed, but there were fresh boot prints in the dirt, different from mine. The tread pattern didn't match my boots. They were smaller, and seemed to stop right at the tent entrance like someone had been standing there watching. That's when I decided I'd seen enough. I packed up my gear, left a marker at the site, and started back toward the trail. I didn't stop to rest. The woods felt different now, not quiet but watchful. Every snap of a twig made my heart jump. I could feel eyes on me, though I never saw anyone. The light faded faster than usual, and by the time I reached the main road it was nearly dark. Back at the station, I filed a report. The next morning, a search team went out to the same spot. They found the tent just like I described, but the notebook was gone. The prints, the pants on the branch, and everything else was there. They searched the area for 3 days and never found a trace of the person who'd camped there. A few weeks later, a sheriff from a nearby county told us a man had been reported missing in that area 2 months earlier. His car was found abandoned by a forest access road, miles from where I found the tent. No signs of struggle, no note, nothing. The photo they showed us looked like it could have been him. To this day, no one knows what happened to him. Sometimes I think about that tent. How neat it was, how still everything felt around it, like time had stopped. I've worked many places since then, seen my share of strange things in the woods, but that one stuck with me more than any other. Not because of what I saw, but because of what I didn't. The woods have a way of swallowing people whole without sound, without trace. And standing there that day, surrounded by trees that seemed to lean closer the longer I stayed, I realized just how easy it is for someone to vanish. Not because of some wild animal or ghost story, but simply because out there no one is watching. I started working as a park ranger in the fall of 2017 at a remote section of Bitter Creek National Forest in northern Idaho. It was the kind of place most people only saw on maps. Long stretches of forest roads that turned into dirt paths, small streams cutting through thick spruce groves, and valleys that filled with fog almost every morning. My post was at Fire Tower 19, an old metal lookout perched on a ridge about 20 miles from the main ranger station. It had electricity from a small generator, a water tank, and a shortwave radio that usually worked depending on the weather. I'd spend 10 days up there, then get 4 days off. It sounded lonely, but I'd grown used to isolation. My main job was watching for smoke columns, checking weather data, and doing patrols along the nearby backcountry trails. Early October that year was dry, unusually dry, and most of us were on alert for wildfires. The wind would howl across the ridge at night, shaking the tower slightly. I remember lying on the narrow cot, listening to the rattling metal and thinking about how far away the nearest person was. When the clouds rolled in, it felt like being trapped inside a gray ocean. It was on my 4th day of the rotation when something started to feel off. I'd gone down one of the side trails, a narrow service path leading to an old cabin site that had been abandoned for decades. It was part of my regular route, but that day I noticed things that hadn't been there before. Fresh tire marks in the dirt road even though the gate at the base of the hill was locked, a crushed soda can near the stream, and a cigarette butt that looked less than a day old. None of the maintenance crew had logged a visit. I brushed it off at first. People sometimes managed to sneak in despite the locked gates. Hunters, hikers, the occasional trespasser, it happened. But the thing that bothered me was how far in they had gone. That trail wasn't easy to find or drive on unless you knew the area well. The next morning I woke before sunrise. The fog was thick enough to swallow everything below the ridge. I took the binoculars and scanned the forest once the sun came up. Down near the valley floor I saw a flicker of movement, a white shape near the tree line. It was there for only a moment before it slipped back into the woods. It could have been a deer or a person wearing light clothing. I couldn't tell, but something about it made me uneasy. Later that afternoon I decided to hike down toward that section of the forest. I logged my route and time before leaving as procedure required. The hike took about 2 hours, most of it downhill through loose soil and heavy brush. The silence in those woods was different, thicker somehow. You could hear your heartbeat between steps. When I reached the spot where I'd seen the movement, I found what looked like a makeshift campsite. It wasn't old. There were footprints in the soft dirt, a patch of ground where a fire had recently been, still black with soot. There was no tent, no sleeping bag, just a couple of beer bottles, a knife sheath, and a crumpled tarp. I noticed drag marks like something heavy had been pulled away from the site toward the creek. I followed them for maybe 30 yards before the ground turned to mud. That's when I found a torn piece of fabric snagged on a root, light gray, maybe from a hoodie or jacket. I radioed the main station, but reception was cutting in and out. I only got half my message through before static drowned it out completely. It was getting late, so I decided to head back before dark. The entire hike back up felt heavier. I couldn't shake the thought of someone else being out there hiding or watching. When I finally reached the tower, it was already dusk. I made myself some instant noodles, logged the findings, and tried to sleep. At around midnight, I woke to the sound of something metal clanging below. The generator was outside, locked in a small cage at the base of the tower. I got up and peered through the narrow window. The night was completely black except for the faint beam of my flashlight cutting through it. The forest below was dead quiet. No wind, no insects. Then a sharp metallic noise again. It sounded like someone rattling the generator cage. I grabbed the flashlight and slowly climbed down the stairs. The beam shook a little in my hand. When I reached the ground, I saw the lock on the cage was twisted halfway open, like someone had tried to force it with a tool. There were fresh footprints in the dirt, boot prints medium size leading away toward the slope. I followed them for maybe 50 feet before they disappeared into the forest. I didn't hear or see anyone, just that strange silence again, like the woods were holding their breath. The next morning I radioed in again and finally got a clear signal. The rangers at the station said they'd send a unit to check the perimeter the next day. I spent most of that day on edge, watching the woods through binoculars. I saw nothing, but that night just after sunset, I noticed something that made my stomach drop. A flicker of light far down in the valley, exactly where that camp had been. A flashlight beam sweeping slowly between trees. Then it went out. I didn't sleep that night. Every sound made my heart race. Around 3 a.m., I heard faint movement on the stairs outside the tower. Just a few steps, then nothing. I sat there in the dark, holding my flashlight, listening. I never turned the light on. I just waited until the sun came up. When the relief crew arrived later that morning, I climbed down to meet them. They found more footprints around the base of the tower, all leading back into the woods. They also found the torn piece of fabric I'd brought back earlier. It matched the sleeve of a hoodie discovered about half a mile from the stream. The kicker was what they found another 2 days later. A small illegal hunting camp deeper in the forest with signs of poaching and several buried carcasses of deer and elk. Whoever had been staying there had packed up in a hurry and vanished. No arrests were made. They never found who it was. But every time I went back to that tower afterward, I couldn't stop thinking about how someone had been moving around my post at night, watching from the trees, maybe just waiting to see what I'd do. It wasn't ghosts, or myths or forest spirits. It was just people. People who knew the woods too well, who didn't want to be found and who weren't afraid to get close in the dark. That realization stuck with me more than anything supernatural ever could. I stayed at Bitter Creek another 2 years, but I never worked another rotation at Fire Tower 19. I asked for reassignment closer to the base, where I could hear engines, voices, and radios. I still love the forest, but I learned something important out there. The quiet places, the ones that seem safest, are sometimes where the worst kinds of people hide. I started working as a park ranger at the Sierra Verde National Forest in northern New Mexico back in 2012. It's a massive stretch of land, thick pine forests, dry canyons, and winding rivers that cut through the valleys. Most people only see the nice parts, the marked trails, the lookout points, the campsites with picnic tables. But my job took me to the areas where nobody goes. The forgotten fire roads and abandoned ranger cabins that hadn't seen use in decades. I liked the quiet at first, but after a while I started to notice that the quiet wasn't always peaceful. Sometimes it felt like the land itself was holding its breath. That year, there had been a string of reports from hikers going missing around the western boundary of the park, near an old disused fire lookout called Coyote Ridge Tower. It was built in the 60s and shut down in the 90s after the road leading up to it washed out. Officially, we weren't supposed to go up there anymore. It wasn't maintained and it wasn't safe. But when a backpacker named Thomas Rivera never came back from a solo trip near that area, my supervisor told me to check the ridge before we started a formal search. It was early August, hot and dry. The kind of heat that made the air shimmer above the dirt. I drove my truck as far as the old logging road allowed and hiked the last few miles. The trail was faint, half covered in overgrown sagebrush and cactus. I carried a day pack with water, a map, and a GPS unit. The silence was heavy, broken only by the distant buzz of insects and the crunch of my boots. About 2 hours in, I found the first sign of him, a small campsite beside a dried creek bed. The ashes in the fire ring were cold, but there was a metal cup half buried in the dirt and a food wrapper pressed flat under a rock. I checked for footprints, but the ground was too hard. It looked like he'd been alone. No signs of struggle, no blood. No torn fabric, nothing, just a site that felt abandoned too quickly. From there, I followed the faint trail upward toward the ridge. The sun was high, the air thinner. I remember the constant hum in my ears, the sound you get when you've been alone for too long. I passed through an old burn zone, blackened tree trunks sticking out of the earth like bones. The air smelled faintly of ash even after all those years. When I finally reached the tower, it looked worse than I'd imagined. The metal stairs were rusted through, and the cabin on top was leaning slightly, one side propped by splintered beams. The forest had swallowed most of it. You could barely see it unless you were looking directly at it. I stood there for a long time, just staring. The first strange thing I noticed was the pile of trash near the base. Food cans, some modern, some old and rusted. There was even a torn backpack that looked newer, black, lightweight with a cracked water bladder still inside. When I checked the tag, the initials TR were stitched into the fabric with a marker. I felt a cold weight in my chest. That was the missing hiker's pack. I radioed it in, but the ridge was too high and the signal was dead. I decided to climb the first few steps of the tower to see if I could get a connection from there. The stairs groaned under me, and I kept one hand on the railing, testing each step. About halfway up, I caught a smell that didn't fit the dry air, something sour, like meat gone bad. I hesitated. The smell came from above, faint but there. When I reached the platform, I found the source. Inside the cabin, a sleeping bag was spread out, and next to it was a small pile of bones. Animal bones, I thought at first. But then I saw the shoes. They were human-sized, one still half-tied. I froze there for a long time, staring. The bones were clean, like something had stripped them, not gnawed but peeled bare. The smell hit harder as I stepped closer. It wasn't just decay, it was old, sour, soaked into the wood. There were signs someone had been staying there after the hiker vanished. Empty food wrappers, a half-burned candle, and a rusted tin cup that looked identical to the one I'd seen at the first campsite. Whoever it was, they'd stayed long enough to make it their shelter. I backed out, careful not to touch anything, and took out my GPS. I marked the coordinates, then started down fast. Halfway down the ridge, I noticed something else that made my stomach twist. Along the tree line were small, neatly stacked piles of rocks, like trail markers, but too many of them, all arranged in patterns that didn't make sense. Each had something wedged under a stone, scraps of fabric, bits of plastic, even teeth. Real teeth. Some human, some animal. By then I'd stopped thinking rationally. I just wanted to get back to the truck. The sun was starting to dip behind the mountains, and the light turned gold and flat. Every sound, every crack of a branch made my nerves jump. I hiked faster, sometimes breaking into a jog when I thought I heard something behind me. But when I turned, it was always nothing, just the empty trees. When I finally reached my truck, my shirt was soaked with sweat. I slammed the door and sat there trying to slow my breathing. The air inside was suffocating, but it felt safer than the forest outside. I started the engine and drove until I got signal again. I called it in, gave the coordinates, and told them about the bones. The next morning, a search and recovery team went up. I wasn't part of that group. They said I needed to file the initial report and rest. Later that day, my supervisor came to find me. He didn't say much, just told me they found remains, human, confirmed as Thomas Rivera's. But there was something else too. Someone had clearly been living in that tower after Rivera died. They found empty cans, newer clothes, and some sort of makeshift bedroll. But whoever it was, they were gone. No footprints, no tracks leading away. Just gone. A week later, I went back with another ranger to help clear the trail and mark it off for closure. The tower was stripped down, the bones collected, everything tagged and bagged. But the piles of rocks were still there. Hundreds of them stretching deeper into the trees. We followed a few of them until the trail faded out into nothing. The last one we found had a small metal tag buried under it. When we brushed off the dirt, it had numbers scratched into it, dates, each one a few years apart. That area's off limits now. They sealed the road and took the tower down after a few months. On paper, the case closed as death due to exposure, but everyone who was out there knows that doesn't make sense. I don't know who was staying in that tower or why they built those piles, but I think about it every time I drive past that side of the park. Sometimes, on still nights, the air gets that same heavy quiet it had up there, and even from miles away, I swear I can still smell that sour, rotting air, the kind that sticks in your throat long after you've left. I started working as a park ranger in 2014, assigned to a remote stretch of land in northern Wyoming known as the Elkhead Reserve. It wasn't the kind of place you saw in travel brochures. There were no paved roads, no gift shops, and no scenic overlooks. It was hundreds of square miles of thick pine, steep valleys, and old trails that hadn't seen a fresh boot print in years. The kind of place where radios go quiet and cell service doesn't exist. I was 34 back then, and I liked the quiet. My station was a small wooden cabin sitting about 8 miles from the main ranger station, accessible only by a dirt road that became impassable after heavy rain. I was used to being alone. Most weeks I spent 5 or 6 days out there, patrolling trails, clearing fallen trees, checking old signs, and making sure no one was camping where they shouldn't be. The work wasn't glamorous, but I liked the rhythm of it. Walk, check, log, move on. That particular spring, something felt off. We'd had a late thaw that year, and the snow melt had left the forest floor soggy and unpredictable. A few times I'd stepped onto what looked like solid ground and sunk ankle-deep in mud. The air was always damp, heavy with the smell of pine rot. I noticed more animal carcasses than usual. Deer picked clean, raccoons lying half-buried in mud, strange drag marks leading off the trail. I told myself it was just predators taking advantage of weakened animals after the long winter. That's normal. Nature doing its thing. But something about the pattern of it, how the remains always seemed to show up along the same back trail, started to bother me. The first real sign that something wasn't right came on a Thursday morning. I had just finished checking a remote campsite called Timberline Point, about 3 miles off the main access road. It hadn't been used in years. The fire ring was buried in moss, and the sign warning visitors about bear activity was half collapsed. As I walked past the edge of camp, I noticed a plastic water bottle lying in the dirt. Modern, not sun-bleached. Someone had been there recently. I scanned the area, but there were no boot prints. Just flattened grass and disturbed pine needles, like someone had tried to smooth them out. I followed the faint disturbance down a narrow game trail that wound between thick stands of lodgepole pine. After about 10 minutes, I came across something strange. A small pile of rocks, maybe a foot high, placed neatly in the middle of the trail. It wasn't natural. The stones were stacked deliberately, flat on top of one another like a marker. I kicked it over, half expecting to find a note or some kind of trail sign, but there was nothing. Just dark soil underneath. I marked the spot on my map and kept walking. That night, back at the cabin, I wrote up a short report about possible unauthorized camping activity near Timberline Point. It wasn't serious enough to radio in. I figured I'd hike the area again the next day and see if there were more signs of people. When I returned the next morning, the rock pile was back, rebuilt exactly as it had been, right in the center of the trail. Only this time there were 2 more, spaced evenly apart about 20 feet down. I stared at them for a while, trying to think of a logical reason. Maybe a hiker was marking their route, though this wasn't a designated trail. Maybe some kids were messing around. But no vehicles had come down the access road in days. I'd know because I was the only one with keys to the gate. The deeper I went, the quieter it got. Not the usual forest quiet, but a strange, unnatural stillness. No bird calls, no rustling, just the sound of my own boots pressing into the damp ground. I started noticing other odd things. Branches snapped at shoulder height, bits of cloth snagged on bark, and once what looked like the corner of a blue tarp half buried in a ditch. When I pulled it free, I found a torn sleeping bag underneath, soaked and moldy, with a pair of scissors lying beside it, rusted but not old. I felt a creeping unease then, the kind that crawls up the back of your neck and sits heavy on your chest. I marked the location, decided I'd head back and report it properly this time. On the way out, I passed the rock piles again. They were gone. Completely. The trail was clear, like no one had ever touched it. Back at the cabin, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I told myself it was just nerves. I'd been in these woods for years. They could play tricks on your mind if you let them. Still, I double-checked the locks that night. The following morning, I woke up to find a small stack of rocks right outside my door, perfectly balanced. I froze for a long time just staring at it. I didn't hear anyone during the night. The ground around the cabin was soft enough that footprints should have shown, but there were none. Just the pile sitting there like a message. I destroyed it, packed up, and decided to head back to the main station early. The drive was about 2 hours along that rough dirt road, and I didn't like the idea of being out there alone another night. About a mile into the drive, I noticed movement in my side mirror, a shape slipping between the trees. I stopped the truck, turned off the engine, and listened. Nothing, just the creaking of trees in the wind. I got out and walked around the truck, scanning the woods. No sound, no tracks, nothing. I climbed back in, locked the doors, and kept driving. When I reached the main station, I filed a detailed report. I even mentioned the rock piles and the items I'd found. The supervisor looked over the report but didn't say much. He just nodded and said he'd send someone to check it out. I didn't hear anything else about it after that. A few weeks later, I was reassigned to a different part of the reserve. Months passed, and I tried to forget about it. Then, late that summer, I ran into one of the newer rangers at a supply station. He mentioned they'd found an old makeshift camp near Timberline Point, a few tarps, torn bedding, and a shallow pit that looked like it had been used for burning. He said they found bones in it, human bones, partial remains, likely a year or two old. They figured someone had been living off the grid and died out there, maybe from exposure. I didn't tell him about the rocks, or the sleeping bag, or how I'd felt something following me that week. There was no point. Even now I still think about those piles of stones, how carefully they were stacked, how they always seemed to appear and disappear without a sound. Someone had been out there, watching, waiting. Maybe they're still out there, marking trails in those quiet woods, long after the rest of us stopped looking. When I left the ranger service a few years later, I drove through Elkhead one last time. The forest looked calm, peaceful, but as I passed the overgrown path that led to Timberline Point, I saw something glint in the sunlight off to the side of the road. A small pile of rocks, freshly built. I've been a park ranger for a little over 7 years now, and during that time I've learned that the scariest things out here are rarely the animals or the weather. It's the people, and the way isolation messes with their minds. But one incident in particular still sits heavy in my chest, and even years later, I sometimes wake up at night with the same tight feeling in my throat that I had that day. It was early September of 2018. I was working at Crescent Valley National Forest, a huge stretch of dense pine and spruce running through central Montana. My post that season was to patrol a remote section called Miller Basin, a part most visitors never saw because it was about 10 miles from the nearest trailhead. The basin was mostly used by experienced backpackers or the occasional hunter with a special permit. I spent most of my weeks alone in a small service cabin that was barely more than a shed with a bunk, a radio, and a logbook. That week had been uneventful. The days were hot and still, and the air carried that thick pine smell that sticks to your clothes. On the morning it happened, I started my usual patrol around 8 a.m., taking the East Ridge Trail that led down into a valley filled with old-growth forest. My main job was to check for illegal fire pits, or the occasional hunter with a special permit. I spent most of my weeks alone in a small service cabin that was barely more than a shed with a bunk, a radio, and a logbook. That week had been uneventful. The days were hot and still, and the air carried that thick pine smell that sticks to your clothes. On the morning it happened, I started my usual patrol around 8 a.m., taking the East Ridge Trail that led down into a valley filled with old-growth forest. clear fallen trees from the paths, and make sure campers had registered properly. I had about 12 miles of trail to cover that day, most of it quiet. A few hours in, I started noticing something odd. Little pieces of blue tarp caught in the brush. The first one I saw was just a scrap, maybe the size of a hand tangled in some low branches. I assumed it had blown off someone's camp gear. Then I saw another piece, then another, all torn, scattered, leading in the same direction off the main trail. It was strange because there weren't supposed to be any active campsites in that area. The map showed it as restricted due to erosion, and the last check-in log had been empty for days. I figured maybe someone ignored the signs and decided to make camp where they weren't supposed to. It wouldn't have been the first time. I decided to follow the bits of tarp. It wasn't far, maybe a half-mile through thick brush, but the deeper I went, the quieter the woods became. No birds, no wind, not even the usual hum of insects. It was like the air itself was holding still. The ground was uneven, soft with layers of pine needles, and the sun filtered through the trees in narrow streaks that barely reached the forest floor. Eventually, I spotted the remains of a small camp ahead. The tarp, or what was left of it, had been tied between two trees and had mostly fallen down. There was a fire ring that had long gone cold and an overturned camping chair. Everything looked old, weathered by rain. I guessed it had been abandoned weeks, maybe months ago. What struck me, though, was how chaotic it all looked. Food wrappers were scattered everywhere, a torn sleeping bag half buried under leaves, a broken flashlight, and what looked like a stack of soaked paper notebooks. I crouched down to check the fire pit, cold, no recent use. The ash was damp and clumped together, which meant the fire had probably been out for a long time. Then I noticed something else. A rope was tied between two trees about 20 feet away, hanging chest-high, and along it were several items clipped on with carabiners, small personal things. A toothbrush, a lighter, a photograph in a plastic sleeve. It looked almost like someone had been trying to organize their belongings, but then just stopped. I checked around for any sign of the camper. Normally, if someone abandoned gear, we'd file it as a lost property report and move on, but something about this felt wrong. The way everything was left behind, like someone had left in a panic. I kept looking around, and about 20 yards downhill I found a second site, or what was left of one. A tent collapsed on itself, half buried under fallen branches. I brushed away the needles and dirt, and as I lifted the fabric, a foul smell hit me hard. It was that unmistakable stench of rot and old decay. I froze. My first thought was an animal had died inside it. Maybe something crawled in and got trapped. But when I lifted the tent fully, I saw a shape, human. The clothes were sun-faded, torn, and the body had clearly been there a while. The skin had darkened and tightened over the bones. Insects everywhere. I didn't move for a full minute. I just stared, feeling my heartbeat in my ears. When I finally managed to radio it in, my hands were shaking. The signal was weak that far out, so I had to climb a ridge to get through. I gave coordinates, then waited. It took the response team almost 5 hours to reach me. And in that time, I sat there with the camp cordoned off by yellow tape, not touching anything, just trying to make sense of it. The investigators later told me the man's ID was still in his pack. His name was Eric Dalton, 37 years old, from Spokane, Washington. He'd gone missing the previous spring. According to reports, he'd been hiking solo and never checked out. Search efforts had stopped months ago when snow made the terrain too dangerous. They concluded he probably got lost, ran out of supplies, and died of exposure. But something about that didn't sit right with me. When they cleared the site, I went back to my cabin and wrote everything in my report. I couldn't stop thinking about the rope line with the belongings, the broken tarp, the way the camp looked like he'd tried to get organized before something went wrong. A week later, I looked up his file, just curiosity, I told myself, and found that he wasn't your average backpacker. He'd been a survival instructor for a private outdoor school. He knew how to handle himself. I started wondering why someone with that much experience would die less than a mile from a freshwater creek and 2 days' hike from a ranger station. He had gear, shelter, food wrappers. He hadn't starved. I thought maybe an injury, but there was no sign of that mentioned in the report. No broken bones, no sign of animal attack. Later, One of the search guys who'd been on the original missing person case told me quietly that when they found his notebooks at the camp, they were mostly destroyed by rain, but a few pages were still legible. The last dated entry was short. It said, "I'm not alone out here. Someone keeps circling the camp at night." I didn't know what to think about that. Could have been paranoia. Being isolated that long can play tricks on your mind. I've seen seasoned hikers start to lose their grip after a few days alone. Still, the idea of someone else out there, watching, was hard to shake. The next season I was reassigned to another district, and I didn't think about it much until one evening, while checking a new section of trail in a completely different part of the park, I came across another small camp. Same kind of setup. Torn tarp, rope lines, scattered belongings. I froze. There was no body that time, but the scene looked eerily similar, like someone had started to settle in and then abandoned everything in a hurry. The weird part was that one of the items clipped to the rope line was a toothbrush, the same brand and color as the one I'd seen at Dalton's site. I filed it as a routine abandoned camp, but I couldn't shake the unease. Maybe it was coincidence. Maybe someone else stumbled on Dalton's camp and mimicked it for some reason. Or maybe there's someone still living out there off the trails, moving from place to place, watching the people who wandered too far from safety. I don't know, but even now, whenever I'm deep in the forest and the air goes silent, I catch myself glancing into the trees, half expecting to see movement where there shouldn't be any. I still patrol alone. I still walk those trails, but I don't follow stray bits of tarp anymore. Not ever again. I started working as a park ranger at Clearview National Forest in 2014. It's a big stretch of land in northern Idaho. Thousands of acres of dense pine, steep valleys, and remote lakes that most people don't even know exist. When I first took the job, I loved everything about it. The quiet, the isolation, the way the world feels stripped down to its raw parts when you're miles from the nearest road. But after a few years, I started to see the darker side of that silence. Out there, when things go wrong, they go wrong slow, and there's no one coming fast to fix it. That fall, I was assigned to patrol the northern boundary, a long section of forest that bordered private land. It was a lonely stretch that rarely saw visitors. Most hikers stayed near the main trails, and even hunters didn't bother with the rocky terrain and deep ravines up there. The only people who wandered that far were the ones who either knew the land very well or didn't want to be found. It was mid-October when the weather turned early. The nights dropped below freezing, and frost began to cling to the grass before dawn. I remember that morning because my truck thermometer read 27 degrees when I left the ranger station. My assignment was to check an old fire watch cabin that sat about 12 miles from the main road. It hadn't been used in years, but there'd been reports of smoke in the area a few nights before. I loaded my pack with gear, a radio and some water, then drove until the dirt road ended. From there, it was a 6-mile hike through uneven ground to reach the cabin. The trail started off well-marked but quickly faded into little more than an old logging path. The forest was thick on both sides, towering pines so tall they blocked out most of the morning light. The deeper I went, the quieter it got. No birds, no wind, nothing but the crunch of frost under my boots. About halfway in, I found the first thing that made me uneasy. There was a deer carcass off the trail, but it wasn't the usual kind of kill. It had been cut open with a knife. Clean lines across the belly, ribs pried apart. Someone had taken the organs and left the rest. It didn't look like poaching. It looked like someone had been doing something deliberate, almost methodical. I radioed it in, but the signal was weak. Static drowned out most of my words, so I made a note to log it once I got back. I marked the spot with a small orange flag from my pack and kept moving. The air grew colder the higher I climbed, and by the time I reached the ridge, I could see my breath coming out in pale clouds. The cabin came into view just after noon, a small one-room structure half sunk into the hillside. The roof sagged in the middle, and the windows were dark. It didn't look like anyone had been there recently, but I noticed boot prints in the dirt near the steps. Not old ones either. The frost around them was broken, still wet around the edges. Someone had been there maybe that morning. The door was slightly ajar, creaking with the wind. I pushed it open and stepped inside. The smell hit first, something sour and heavy like rot mixed with smoke. The interior was cluttered with old ranger supplies, a rusted lantern, broken stove, empty cans. But on the table there were fresh items, a thermos, a plastic lighter, and a half-empty can of beans that still looked wet. Whoever was there had been eating recently. In the corner, a sleeping bag lay spread out with a dark stain near the top, something that looked too much like dried blood. I stood there for a long moment, just listening. Nothing. Not even the usual sounds of wind through the boards. I checked the perimeter around the cabin. Behind it was a small clearing that led into another narrow path, one that wasn't on any of the official maps. It looked like it had been used often. The brush was trampled down and there were cigarette butts scattered around. I followed it for a bit just to see where it went, and it wound down toward a small creek about half a mile away. That's where I found the camp. It was hidden well. 2 small tents made from tarps, a crude fire ring built from rocks, and a pile of trash that looked like it had been there for weeks. Food wrappers, empty fuel canisters, scraps of clothing. But there was something else, photographs. Dozens of them scattered around the fire pit. All of them were of hikers, some standing near trail markers, some sitting by their tents, all taken from a distance like someone had been watching them without their knowledge. My stomach dropped when I noticed that some of the photos were marked with red pen circles, around faces, around tents, around backpacks. I gathered a few of the photos and stuffed them in my jacket pocket. I tried the radio again, but the signal was dead in the valley. I made the decision to head back toward the cabin and hike out. I didn't want to stay up there any longer than I had to, but as I turned, I heard a crack. Not the sound of a branch falling, but the sharp snap of someone stepping on a stick. I froze. It came from the direction of the ridge above me. I waited, scanning the trees, but saw nothing. The forest felt alive in a way it hadn't earlier. Every sound seemed too close. I started moving fast. My heart was pounding, and I kept glancing behind me, half expecting to see someone step out from the trees. I didn't run, but my pace was quick enough that I slipped twice on the frosted ground. When I reached the cabin again, I noticed something that made my stomach twist. The sleeping bag was gone. Just gone. I hadn't touched it, and now it wasn't there. The thermos and can were still on the table, but the bag, the one with the dried stain, was gone. I left immediately. The sun was already dipping behind the ridge, and the shadows grew long across the trail. I hiked hard, trying to get as much distance as I could before dark. Every sound behind me felt like footsteps. Every rustle of leaves made me tighten my grip on my radio. By the time I reached the truck, the forest was pitch black. When I got back to the station, I handed in the report and showed my supervisor the photos. The sheriff's department went out there the next morning with a small team. They found the camp just like I described, but most of the stuff was gone. No tents, no trash, no photos. The cabin was empty too, except for a burned pile of paper in the middle of the floor. A few weeks later, we got notice from nearby rangers that hikers had been reporting strange behavior around that same area. Someone following them from a distance, standing just far enough back that they couldn't see clearly who it was. They closed that section of the park for the winter. When spring came, it reopened like nothing had happened. But I've never gone back up there. Sometimes I still think about those photos, about the boot prints in the frost, about how close that person must have been while I was there. The part that sticks with me most is the smell inside that cabin, the sour mix of rot and smoke. I've smelled a lot of things in this job, dead animals, forest fires, mold, but that smell was different. It smelled like someone had lived there for a long time, too long, and the fact that they knew the trails well enough to disappear without a trace makes me wonder how many more places like that are hidden out there, just far enough from where anyone ever looks. I've worked as a park ranger for almost 10 years now, and if there's one thing I've learned, it's that the wilderness doesn't care who you are or how much experience you have. You can study maps, memorize trails, know every plant and animal by name, and still find yourself in a situation where all that knowledge means nothing. The forest doesn't owe you safety. It just lets you in and hopes you know when to leave. Back in 2018, I was stationed at Black Hollow State Park in northern Montana. It's one of those parks that doesn't get much attention. No famous waterfalls or mountain peaks, just endless stretches of pine forest, narrow trails, and a few lakes that barely show up on a map. I'd been there for 3 years by then, and most of my work was routine, maintaining trails, checking permits, doing fire watch, and occasionally helping lost hikers. I was 32 at the time, in good shape and pretty comfortable spending days alone out there. That summer had been dry, really dry. Fires were a big concern. One section of the park, the West Ridge, had been closed off to visitors because of an earlier lightning strike that started a small fire. We'd put it out quickly, but the whole area still smelled like burnt wood, and the ground was unstable from all the ash and erosion. The higher-ups wanted it surveyed before reopening, and that task somehow landed on me. It was supposed to be a one-day job. Hike out early morning, take soil and moisture readings, document the burned area, then camp for the night and return the next day. I packed light tent, first aid kit, GPS, camera, notebook, food for 2 days, and my sidearm. Nothing unusual. The first half of the day went fine. The hike was quiet. The air was dry and the smell of burnt pine hung low in the valley. The fire had cleared out much of the undergrowth, so it was easy to move around. By late afternoon, I'd finished most of the documentation. I found a flat spot near the edge of the burn zone, close enough to see the damage, but far enough that the soil could hold a tent stake, and started setting up camp. Around dusk, I noticed something that didn't sit right. About 50 yards downslope, near a cluster of charred stumps, there was a shape that didn't belong. At first, I thought it was a fallen log, but as the light changed, it looked more like a structure, maybe a small shack or an old hunting blind. I hadn't seen it on any maps, and nothing in my reports mentioned it. Curiosity got the better of me. After eating, I took my flashlight and walked down to check it out. It turned out to be a shack. Small, maybe 8 by 10 feet, made of old weathered boards that were half burned from the fire. It had no windows, just a single door hanging half off its hinges. I assumed it was some kind of old trapper's cabin. The ground around it was disturbed, like someone had walked there recently, though I didn't see any clear footprints in the ash. Inside, it was empty except for a few rusted cans, a broken camp chair, and what looked like the remains of a sleeping bag melted into the floorboards. There was also a small pit dug into the dirt, maybe 2 feet deep, with a pile of ashes inside. Probably used as an indoor fire pit, which was strange because it was way too small for heating. I didn't think much more about it at the time. I took a few pictures, made a note in my log, and went back to camp before it got completely dark. That night I couldn't sleep. The air felt heavy, even though the temperature had dropped. Every few minutes I'd hear faint snapping sounds in the distance. Not the random cracks of cooling wood, but something more deliberate. Footsteps maybe, but in that burned forest, sounds travel oddly. Sometimes a twig snapping half a mile away sounds like it's right behind you. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I kept listening, waiting for some pattern, but every time I thought I'd figured out where the noise was coming from, it stopped. Sometime after midnight, I noticed the faint smell of smoke. Not the leftover scent from the old fire, but fresh smoke, and sharp and immediate. I sat up, thinking maybe something had reignited nearby. I unzipped the tent and looked out. The forest was completely dark, no glow, no sparks, but the smell was definitely stronger. I grabbed my flashlight and scanned around. The beam landed briefly on something reflective about 20 feet away. It looked like a piece of glass or metal. I took a few steps toward it, careful not to make noise. When I got close enough, I saw what it was. An old tin coffee cup sitting upright on a log. It looked clean, like it had been placed there recently. There were no other items around it. No signs of anyone camping. Just that single cup. That's when I realized the smoke wasn't coming from anywhere visible. It was on me, in my clothes, my bag, my hair. It was like someone had been burning something nearby earlier, close enough for the smoke to settle on everything I had. I went back to my tent and waited for daylight. I didn't sleep at all. At dawn, I packed up fast. I wanted to get out of there and report what I found. The shack, the cup, the smell. On my way out, I noticed fresh impressions in the ash near where I'd set up camp. They weren't full prints, just areas where the surface was disturbed, like someone had been crouching there watching. Halfway down the ridge, I stopped at the shack again to take one last look. The door was closed this time. I was absolutely sure I'd left it open. When I pushed it, it resisted for a second before swinging in. The inside looked different. The fire pit was gone. The dirt was smooth, freshly leveled like someone had covered it up during the night. I didn't linger. I left that area, followed the old fire break road until I reached the main trail and kept moving until I hit the ranger station around noon. When I turned in my report, I left out a few details. I said the shack was unsafe and recommended it be removed. About a month later, a maintenance crew went out there to dismantle it. When they came back, they said there was no shack, just an open patch of burned ground. I thought they were joking at first, but when I checked the GPS coordinates from my report and compared them with new satellite imagery, they were right. Nothing was there. No structure, no debris, not even the patch of dirt I'd seen. For years I tried to rationalize it. Maybe the fire had flared up again and burned what was left of the cabin. Maybe erosion had wiped it out. Maybe I marked the wrong location. But the one thing I can't explain, the one thing that still makes me uneasy, is that coffee cup. It wasn't in any of my photos, not even the ones I took that first evening. I checked every single picture later on, thinking I must have missed it. It just wasn't there. But I remember holding it. I remember how clean it looked, like someone had used it that morning. I left Black Hollow the following spring and transferred to a park in Idaho. I've worked a dozen sites since then, but I've never gone back to that ridge. Sometimes when I smell smoke, I still think about that night, how I couldn't tell what was burning or where the smell came from. And sometimes I wonder if someone was still living out there, quietly moving through that burned forest, unseen, waiting for the fire to drive everyone else away so they could stay. Maybe they still are. I've been working as a park ranger for 8 years now, mostly in remote areas of Colorado, where the forest stretches for miles and the mountains seem endless. You get used to the quiet out here. You get used to being alone for long stretches of time, sometimes days. That kind of silence does something to you. It sharpens your senses, but also makes your mind wander in directions you don't always like. It was late September of 2017 when this happened. The summer crowds were gone and the park had shifted into that strange shoulder season. Too cold for most campers, but not quite winter yet. I was stationed at a small outpost near the northern boundary of the park, about 25 miles from the nearest town, Fraser Ridge. It was the kind of assignment most rangers didn't volunteer for. No cell signal, patchy radio contact, and long nights with nothing but the hum of the wind and the occasional crack of branches echoing through the valley. That week, I'd been checking the old fire roads and clearing fallen debris before the snow started. There was one back trail that always gave me trouble, Route 19C. It used to connect to an old logging site that shut down decades ago, and now it's mostly used by the occasional hunter or backpacker who thinks they know what they're doing. The trail ran deep into a dense part of the forest where the trees grew tall and tight together. Even at noon, it stayed dim in there. One afternoon, I got a report over the radio from the main station that a car had been found parked near the 19C trailhead for 3 days straight. No one had checked in or called about a missing person, but it was protocol to investigate. I set out early the next morning around 6:30 right after sunrise. The air was cold and thin, the kind that stings your lungs when you breathe. The car was a silver Honda Civic, covered in dust and pine needles. The windows were fogged over from the cold nights, and inside there were a few fast food wrappers, an empty water bottle, and a folded map on the passenger seat. The keys were gone. I noted the license plate and started down the trail, figuring I'd probably find someone camping illegally or maybe a hiker who'd gone deeper than they planned. The trail narrowed quickly, and within a few minutes the sound of the wind faded under the heavy canopy. All I could hear was the crunch of my boots and the creak of my pack straps. The deeper I went, the colder it got. even though the sun was climbing higher. I remember seeing fresh boot prints in the mud, probably one person medium-size heading in about a day or two before me. They were spaced evenly, no signs of panic or injury. About 4 miles in, I started seeing odd things. Bits of torn fabric caught on branches, a red flannel shirt sleeve here, a piece of nylon strap there. Nothing that screamed danger, but enough to make me stop and take photos for the report. The prints continued past a small creek crossing and up toward an old logging road that hadn't been used since the early 2000s. By noon, I reached what looked like a clearing where the old logging camp used to be. Most of it was gone now, just scattered foundations, rusted equipment, and the skeleton of a cabin half collapsed into the dirt. I could smell something faint but sharp, like a mix of metal and decay. It wasn't strong enough to be a dead animal, but it was there, lingering. I followed the smell toward the far edge of the clearing where the ground sloped down toward a ravine. The trees were thicker there, tangled with fallen logs and old stumps. That's when I saw a small blue tent, half collapsed and dirty. The rain fly was torn, and a sleeping bag was sticking out of the opening. I crouched down, careful not to touch anything yet. The tent had clearly been there for a few days, maybe a week. Inside were a few personal items, an open can of beans, a lighter, a small cooking pot, a pair of socks hung up on a string that had snapped. But no backpack, no food bag, and no sign of the person. Just the smell again, faint but enough to keep me alert. I called in my position on the radio, but the signal was too weak. Just static. I marked the spot with orange tape and decided to sweep the area within a 100-yard radius. The forest floor was uneven, covered in pine needles and soft moss that swallowed footprints fast. I followed a faint depression in the brush that looked like it had been trampled recently. It led downhill toward the ravine. The ground grew muddier and I could hear the distant trickle of water. At the base of the ravine was a narrow stream cutting through the dirt. There were drag marks there, deep and clear. Something or someone had been pulled through the mud. The marks ended near a cluster of boulders where the smell hit me full force this time, thick and sour. When I stepped closer, I found a torn backpack wedged between two rocks. It had been slashed open, and inside were clothes soaked through with mud and what looked like dried blood. I stepped back and took a long look at the area. There was no body, but the signs were all there. Someone had been hurt badly, maybe worse. I scanned the trees for movement, for any sign that whoever did this might still be around. The forest was silent, not even birds. I hiked back up to the clearing and finally got a sliver of radio reception. I called in the discovery and requested backup. It took nearly 4 hours for another ranger and a deputy to reach me. By then the light was fading fast and the temperature had dropped again. We searched until dark and set up a small perimeter. The next morning, a full search team came in with dogs. They found the rest of the trail down the ravine, and about half a mile farther, they found what was left of a body tangled in roots near the stream. Male, early 30s, no ID on him. But the car at the trailhead matched his registration. The coroner's report later said cause of death was blunt force trauma and multiple fractures. There were no animal bite marks, no signs of a struggle with wildlife. It was all human. The weirdest part was the second set of boot prints found near the site. Larger, heavier, leading away toward the west side of the forest. Those prints were never matched to anyone. No missing person, no record. They just vanished into the woods about 2 miles out. I stayed in that post for another year, but I never liked going back to that trail. Every time I passed the 19C junction, I'd get that same cold feeling in my chest, like the air got heavier all of a sudden. They closed off that section permanently the next season. Sometimes when I'm on patrol in the early morning, I still think about that tent, the quiet forest, and those drag marks leading into the ravine. The official report called it an unsolved homicide, but the part that still gets to me isn't the death itself. It's knowing that somewhere out there someone walked away from that scene, calm enough to leave no trace, no sound, no sign, just silence. And in the middle of all that endless forest, silence is sometimes the loudest thing you can hear. I was a park ranger in northern Montana back in 2015. stationed at a small outpost near the edge of the Cabinet Mountains. The area was thick with pine, alder, and hemlock, and the terrain was rough enough that most hikers avoided it. Our district was quiet most of the year except for summer when backpackers came through, but even then it wasn't a busy park. I liked that. The solitude, the cold streams, the clean air. It was the reason I joined the service in the first place. That summer, I was working alone for a 2-week stretch while another ranger, Peterson, was out on leave. My job was mostly to check trail markers, maintain backcountry campsites, and make sure no one was poaching or lighting fires in the wrong spots. The first week went as expected. Long days on foot, quiet nights in the cabin, the usual radio check-ins with dispatch. It wasn't until the second week that I noticed something was off. I first found it while hiking up the old service road that led to an abandoned fire lookout called Ridge Point Tower. It had been decommissioned years earlier because the foundation was unstable, but the structure was still standing. I wasn't supposed to go up there, but part of the road still intersected one of our newer trails, so I had to inspect it every once in a while. About 3 miles up, I saw tire tracks on the dirt. That road hadn't seen vehicle use in years. Our rangers traveled by foot or ATV, and no one had clearance to drive beyond the gate at the base. The tire marks looked fresh. At first, I thought it might have been a lost hunter or maybe someone sneaking into camp illegally. But the deeper I went, the stranger it got. The tire tracks veered off into a patch of grass and stopped. No footprints, no drag marks, no indication of where the vehicle had gone after that. Just stopped like the driver vanished mid-turn. I remember standing there for a good minute listening to the forest. It was completely still, not even wind through the trees. I marked the spot with GPS and continued up. Near the tower, the air felt heavier. It was the middle of July, but up there it was cool enough to see your breath sometimes. The tower itself was a skeleton of old wood and rusted metal, with the stairs missing in sections. I didn't climb it, just circled the base to check for signs of trespassers. That's when I saw the makeshift campsite. Someone had camped maybe 30 feet from the tower. The remains of a fire pit were still warm, and there were scraps of food wrappers and a small propane canister nearby. No tent, no pack, no sign of anyone leaving. Just the remnants of a stay that couldn't have been more than a day old. I logged it as unauthorized camping and packed up what I could, figuring I'd file a report later. But what really unsettled me was a small spiral-bound notebook lying beside a rock, half buried under dirt. I flipped through it briefly. Most of the pages were filled with scribbled coordinates, times, and short notes like, "Heard movement again," or "Can't find trail marker." The handwriting was uneven, rushed. The last page had one line scrawled across it. "They're using the old tunnels again." That night I couldn't stop thinking about that line. I'd heard about old mining tunnels in the area, but they'd been sealed decades ago. Some ran for miles beneath the hills, left over from copper mining in the early 1900s. It wasn't the kind of place anyone should be poking around in. Unstable, oxygen poor, often flooded. I decided I'd look around the next morning just to be sure no one was doing something illegal up there. The following day I hiked back up. The air was foggy and cool, and by the time I reached the tower again, it felt like the whole mountain was swallowed in low cloud. I started moving along the ridge, looking for signs of a shaft entrance. After about an hour, I found one. It was hidden behind a thicket of brush, a jagged, dark opening about 4 feet high, framed by old timbers that were rotting away. There were boot prints in the mud leading inside. I didn't go in right away. I waited, listening. There was a faint echo like water dripping somewhere far back in the tunnel. No voices, no movement. I took a few photos and stepped in just far enough to look around with my flashlight. The tunnel stretched into darkness, damp walls glistening. About 20 feet in, I saw a piece of torn fabric stuck on a nail. Looked like the corner of a jacket. And next to it, fresh footprints, deeper this time, going farther in. That's when I decided to stop. Going deeper alone was against protocol, and frankly, it felt wrong. The tunnel seemed to swallow the sound of my breathing. I backed out, marked the location, and hiked back down to radio it in. But when I reached the base of the mountain and tried calling dispatch, I got nothing but static. I walked a few more miles, stopped again, same result. The entire channel was dead. That night I stayed in the cabin trying to shake the unease, but it hung over me like a weight. Around midnight I heard an engine somewhere far up the service road. It was faint, like a truck climbing slow in low gear. I stepped outside and listened. The sound came and went, fading in and out, then vanished altogether. I didn't sleep much after that. The next morning I hiked back up one last time. The fog had cleared, but when I reached the tower, everything looked disturbed. The ashes of the old campfire had been spread out. The notebook was gone, and the footprints near the mine were all scuffed over like someone had tried to erase them. I checked the entrance again. It had been sealed. Someone had nailed a plank of wood across it and stamped the ground flat. Fresh tire marks led back down the slope. That was the moment I realized someone didn't want that place found. I never saw any report filed about it afterward. When I told my supervisor later that week, he told me to drop it. Said it was probably some local squatters or off-grid types, nothing to worry about. But a month later, another ranger found a burned-out truck deep in the woods near that same ridge. The plates were filed off, and there were no personal items inside. The VIN was untraceable. I still think about that notebook sometimes, about the way the handwriting grew shakier toward the end. I think whoever wrote it saw something in those tunnels they shouldn't have. The tracks, the vanishing campsite, the erased footprints, it all pointed to people, not anything supernatural. People hiding something in those hills. When my rotation ended that fall, I transferred to a different district. I told myself it was for the better pay and easier trails, but the truth is, I didn't want to stay anywhere near Ridge Point. Even now, years later, I can still see that plank nailed across the dark mouth of that tunnel. It's probably rotted away by now, maybe collapsed in, but I doubt it's empty. Whatever was going on up there wasn't an accident or just trespassers. It was organized, controlled, and whoever they were, they made sure that no one else went looking again.